People walked into Victorian ballrooms, believing they were entering places of beauty. Yet many had no idea they were stepping into rooms built on pressure, deception, and quiet suffering. Behind every smile was a bruise, behind every dance was a negotiation, and behind every shimmering light was a story no one dared to speak aloud. Tonight, we step inside those halls to see what truly happened when the music began. So before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step into a grand Victorian ballroom without knowing its reputation, the first impression would almost certainly be one of overwhelming beauty. The lights, the mirrors, the polished floors, and the steady hum of classical music would seem like evidence of refinement, as if the room itself had been designed to convince every visitor that elegance could erase everything unpleasant. Outside its doors, people who entered such a space often believed it represented the height of social achievement. They came dressed in their finest garments, tightening every ribbon, straightening every glove, and trusting that the room would carry them upward in the eyes of others. The chandeliers were always the first thing to demand attention. Their crystals caught every flicker of flame and multiplied it across the ceiling, showering the room with white light that hid the cracks in the walls and blurred the exhaustion on the dancers' faces. Below those lights stood tall mirrors that never rested. They reflected gowns, jewels, and painted smiles, as if creating a second world in which everyone looked wealthier, happier, and more composed than they truly were. People liked to pause near these mirrors, pretending to adjust their gloves, when in reality they were checking whether they blended in well enough to be accepted among the rest. The gowns were heavy and elaborate. Layers of silk and tulle, shaped into enormous silhouettes, forced each woman to take careful, measured steps. Beneath those gowns were corsets laced until the ribs grew numb, the spine strained and the breath shortened to thin, controlled gasps. To remain composed under such pressure requires training from childhood. Girls learned early that beauty demanded restraint, and restraint was praised more than comfort. Gloves stretched tight over their hands, hiding calluses, bruises, or trembling fingers. Everything unpleasant had to be concealed. The ballroom allowed only the appearance of perfection. Men dressed no more comfortably. Their waistcoats and cravats were starched until stiff, restricting movement almost as firmly as corsets. They were expected to stand straight, neither relaxed nor tense, and to offer the illusion of confidence, even when anxiety sat tight in their throats. Their role was to demonstrate control over their posture, their steps, and their manners. In a ballroom, a single gesture judged an entire character. People watched one another, constantly searching for signs of hesitation or social inadequacy. The music completed the illusion of grandeur. Violins, flutes, and pianofortes produced melodies that wrapped themselves around the dancers, creating an atmosphere of gentle order. Yet the beauty of the sound masked a truth that few were willing to admit. The ballroom was less a place of joy and more a stage. Every movement inside it carried a silent expectation. Each smile was practiced, each laugh calculated, and each conversation shaped by the awareness that one misstep might follow someone for years. It was a world that demanded more than beauty. It demanded obedience. People called the ballroom a place for celebration, but to many it felt more like a test. A young woman's worth could rise or fall within a single evening. A misplaced glance, a dress that wrinkled at the wrong moment, or a stumble during a dance could damage her reputation far beyond repair. Families invested months of preparation and the little money they had to ensure their daughters would be presented flawlessly. Meanwhile, those daughters learned to hide discomfort, to ignore pain, and to maintain expressionless serenity. Anyone who revealed fatigue risked being labeled weak or unrefined. Those who watched from the sidelines often carried their own burdens. A mother might smile at her daughter, while silently calculating which suitors to encourage and which families to avoid. A father might stand near the refreshments table, pretending to enjoy the evening while knowing that every conversation surrounding him was a negotiation disguised as pleasantry. Wealthy families rarely came for dancing, they came for alliances. They came to observe potential spouses, potential business partners, and potential threats. Every small detail mattered: the quality of the embroidery, the cut of the jacket, the diamonds around a woman's throat, even the posture a young man held while bowing. Yet despite all this pressure, outsiders often believed that the ballroom was a symbol of leisure. They imagined it as a place where people gathered simply to enjoy music and companionship. The reality was far different. The dances themselves were rehearsed, strict, and monitored. Couples moved in patterns that allowed little room for individuality. A woman who stepped too quickly or a man who turned too slowly marked themselves as untrained. Those near them pretended not to notice, but the slightest irregularity traveled through the room with impressive speed. Pristine surfaces and delicate music could not soften the truth. The ballroom was built to evaluate, not to relax. Even the air was curated. Before events began, servants polished the floors until they reflected light like still water. Flowers were arranged to mask smells drifting in from the city outside, though the heavy perfumes often mingled into a sweetness so dense it became oppressive. People inside the room sometimes felt faint, but fainting itself was considered a minor embarrassment. Women who lost consciousness blamed their corsets, their excitement, or the heat, never the underlying fear that accompanied each of their steps. Despite its appearance, the ballroom belonged only to those who knew how to navigate it. Newcomers felt its expectations instantly, even if they could not name them. A slight hesitation before stepping onto the floor revealed inexperience. A bow that dipped too low exposed unfamiliarity. A smile held a second too long raised questions no one voiced. The ballroom contained its own language, one built from gestures, glances, and silent judgments. Those who failed to speak it found themselves quietly excluded. People loved to describe these gatherings as refined, but refinement was merely the lacquer spread thin over a structure built from ambition, fear, and competition. Behind every polite greeting lay uncertainty. Behind every compliment lay calculation. Behind every polished shoe and shimmering gem lay the effort of an entire household, all striving to maintain the illusion that their place in society was secure. By the time the music reached its final notes, most dancers felt drained. Their feet ached, their ribs throbbed from the pressure of corsets, and their faces hurt from continuous polite expressions. But they endured it because attending the ballroom meant being seen, and being seen meant survival. In Victorian society, visibility was currency, and the ballroom was where that currency was most commonly traded. The room seemed gentle, yet every detail whispered something harsher. The expectations hidden beneath the glittering lights were waiting for anyone who cared to notice. And somewhere inside that polished world, a silent tension was already forming, preparing to reveal what truly unfolded once the music began. The ballroom functioned as far more than a place to dance. It stood at the center of aristocratic life, absorbing hopes, expectations, and calculations with a steadiness that rarely faltered. Families entered, knowing precisely why they were there, and none of those reasons had much to do with music. The chandeliers, the polished floors, and the carefully arranged seating all formed a stage on which futures were quietly negotiated. For people of rank, the ballroom was an arena where alliances were shaped, where fortunes could be preserved or lost, and where a single misjudgment might alter the direction of an entire household. Most families approached these gatherings with deliberate intention. They arrived not simply to be seen, but to confirm their place among others who believed themselves equally important. Fathers noted which families had climbed recently and which had drifted downward in wealth or influence. Mothers kept mental lists of sons and daughters whose reputations were promising enough to consider, while cautiously avoiding those surrounded by whispers. Daughters stepped into the light, knowing they were being evaluated not for their character, but for what they might represent: beauty, obedience, lineage, and the potential to strengthen a connection between two houses. For young women, the ballroom could feel both vast and confining. They stood at the edge of the floor, holding their gloves in impeccable posture, aware that each man who approached did so with intent, shaped by his own family's expectations. Their gowns, tailored to perfection, became instruments in a ritual that required them to be seen before they could be known. Many felt the burden of this visibility more heavily than the corsets that restricted their breathing. They were observed from every angle: their height, their grace, their composure, even the way they lowered their gaze. Each detail contributed to a silent ledger that families relied upon when assessing prospects. Men, meanwhile, carried their own set of responsibilities. They roamed the ballroom with the appearance of freedom, but their choices were just as constrained. Their conversations were monitored, their invitations interpreted, and their movements watched with quiet intensity. A young man who lingered too long near a particular family risked implying interest his relatives had not approved. One who ignored certain introductions appeared dismissive or arrogant. Even the act of requesting a dance held consequences for it, suggested a level of intention that others could easily misread. Every decision was weighed against reputation, expectation, and future alliances. Behind the scenes, the ballroom served as a discreet meeting ground, where families pursued arrangements that were already unfolding long before the first dance began. No contracts were exchanged in the open, yet the steps toward marriage often took shape in these carefully orchestrated gatherings. Two families might greet each other politely, their smiles faint and composed, while each side measured the other's prospects. Daughters were introduced with a subtle flourish, and sons offered courteous bows that masked the pressure resting on their shoulders. These gestures were not simply polite, they were part of the quiet negotiations that kept aristocratic circles intact. For many women, the experience felt less like participation and more like presentation. They were positioned strategically within the room, illuminated by the chandeliers, at precisely the angles that made jewels glimmer and fabrics appear richer. Their role was to embody an ideal that their families wished to advertise. They spoke little, moved carefully, and maintained an expression of calm, even under scrutiny. Some accepted this role with practiced composure. Others endured it silently, knowing that refusal would not be tolerated. The ballroom did not ask whether a woman wished to be chosen. It only demanded that she be ready. Still, the pressure touched men equally, though less visibly. A young man's presence at a ballroom signaled his family's readiness to consider alliances, whether he wanted them or not. He was expected to demonstrate financial stability, a polite manner, and reliability in movement. A stumble during a dance or a poorly timed bow could raise doubts about his suitability. Families evaluated him with the same intensity, directed at young women, but with expectations shaped by inheritance and public duty. Though he might appear confident, he often navigated the room with the awareness that every step was observed. Marriage arrangements did not materialize through formal discussions, but through a series of coordinated interactions. A mother noticing a particular pairing might shift her daughter closer to a group where promising suitors gathered. A father might engage in a seemingly casual conversation with another man while silently evaluating the potential for alliance. The dancers themselves, sensing these currents, moved through the room, like figures in a delicate game whose rules had been set long before they were born. They danced because dancing was expected. They smiled because smiling preserved options. Each action, however small, became a piece of a larger strategy. Some attendees found comfort in this predictable system. It offered structure to lives otherwise shaped by uncertainty. Others found it suffocating, but compliance remained necessary. Those who resisted quietly discovered that resistance carried consequences: fewer invitations, colder receptions, and a reputation for unpredictability. The ballroom rewarded conformity, punishing any deviation from its unwritten codes. It was in its own way an instrument of control, maintaining order among families who wished to protect their status. Throughout the evening, alliances flickered into existence, some lasting only minutes, others strengthening with each dance. A look exchanged across the room could trigger speculation that continued well after the night ended. A polite refusal could ripple outward, altering paths that had seemed certain. Every action contributed to a web of impressions that families used to steer their next decisions. In this sense, the ballroom functioned as a living map of social ambition, constantly redrawn with each passing event. Marriage for the people inside these walls was not merely a personal matter. It was a tool, a strategy, and a safeguard. Families sought unions that would preserve wealth or elevate their name, and the ballroom provided the ideal environment to pursue such goals while concealing their intentions behind soft music and graceful steps. The dancers themselves felt this weight even when their movements appeared effortless. They were navigating a landscape in which affection mattered far less than alignment, and where outcomes shaped futures beyond their control. The ballroom promised elegance, yet every interaction carried the heaviness of expectation. The people inside it danced under the illusion of choice, while following paths set long before they entered. And beneath the polished surface, a smaller gesture was already waiting to tip the balance of an entire season. In the ballroom, nothing was ever truly insignificant. The smallest gesture, the faintest movement, or the briefest pause could travel farther than any spoken word. People carried themselves with a precision that bordered on restraint, aware that every motion was read, interpreted, and remembered. The chandeliers cast bright reflections on polished floors, but even that light could not soften the scrutiny that governed the room. Every participant understood, whether they admitted it or not, that their future might rest upon an instant easily overlooked by an outsider. A simple touch of the hand carried a weight few would dare to acknowledge aloud. When a man offered his arm to escort a woman toward the center of the floor, the pressure of his fingertips, the steadiness of his grip, and the moment he chose to extend it, all held meaning. A touch held too long suggested intent. A touch offered too quickly hinted at impatience. But the gentlest, most deliberate brush of fingers, barely noticeable to those around, could suggest something deeper, something close to a quiet proposal, masked beneath layers of etiquette. Families watching from the edge understood these signals better than the dancers themselves, and their reactions often determined the path the evening would take. Eye contact, though brief, carried its own dangers. A woman who allowed her gaze to drift toward the wrong person risked being tied to a rumor before the next piece of music began. A man who looked too intently at someone outside the expected circle invited speculation that could haunt him for months. A fleeting glance across the room, even one born of curiosity or accident, could attach two names in conversations before either had taken a single step toward the dance floor. The eyes revealed what the mouth was forbidden to say, and in a place where silence served as currency, people relied heavily on what could be observed but never spoken. Dances amplified these risks. Every step was monitored not just by the other dancers but by those who drifted quietly along the edges of the room, pretending disinterest while examining every movement with precision. A misaligned step or a shift in posture might seem trivial to an outsider, yet it often signaled something more alarming to those attuned to the subtleties of ballroom behavior. A stumble could be interpreted as nerves brought on by affection. A well-timed turn might be mistaken for practiced familiarity. Even the pace at which two dancers moved toward one another could be examined for deeper meaning. Supervision extended far beyond simple etiquette. Older relatives, especially mothers, observed with a level of scrutiny that would have felt suffocating to anyone unaccustomed to such environments. They monitored how close dancers stood to one another, the way hands were placed, the tilt of the head during conversation, and the ease with which partners moved in harmony. A misjudged tilt, or a hand held a fraction too high, could prompt discreet but decisive interventions. A mother's raised eyebrow or a father's subtle shift in position along the perimeter often redirected the entire course of the evening. The dancers themselves knew the risks. They moved with careful deliberation, measuring their breathing and arranging their expressions into something calm and unreadable. Many appeared serene, but beneath the surface tension built with every rotation. A woman might feel the weight of a hand at her waist and wonder whether it lingered longer than it should. A man might sense the faintest tremor in a partner's fingers and consider whether it signaled fear, excitement, or disapproval. These small observations shaped their choices for the remainder of the night. They learned to read the room not through its music, but through the near-invisible cues woven into each dance. As the evening progressed, speculation intensified. People along the walls whispered behind fans or exchanged glances filled with subtle meaning. A woman who danced twice with the same partner found herself the subject of immediate interest. A man who crossed the floor too quickly to greet someone was met with curiosity. Nothing was taken at face value. The room functioned like a silent network of speculation in which each observation layered upon the next until a coherent narrative was formed, whether or not it resembled the truth. Some dancers tried to escape these expectations, believing they could move with freedom if they ignored the eyes around them. But the ballroom rarely allowed such attempts to go unnoticed. Those who acted without restraint faced consequences almost immediately. A woman who laughed too openly risked appearing frivolous. A man who touched a hand without the proper formality risked being seen as forward or careless. Even innocence could be misinterpreted, for the ballroom was built on interpretations, not intentions. The pressure of this environment shaped behavior long before dancers ever set foot in the room. Women practiced controlling their breathing to avoid revealing emotion. Men rehearsed their expressions so they would never appear overly invested or uninterested. The goal was to remain balanced, composed, and unremarkable. Being memorable in the wrong way could seal a fate no one desired. Those who mastered this discipline could move through the ballroom with a calmness that suggested confidence, even if beneath that calmness lay uncertainty. What made these gestures so powerful was the room's collective willingness to believe in them. People trusted the language of movement more than they trusted spoken explanations. A rumor sparked by a misinterpreted glance could outlast any attempt to correct it. Families made decisions based on what they thought they had seen, rather than what they had truly witnessed. The ballroom rewarded those who understood this silent language and punished those who underestimated it. As the night wore on and the music softened, The weight of these gestures only increased. A single misstep could overshadow an entire season of careful behavior. A hand held a moment too long could ignite expectations that neither dancer intended to create. Even exhaustion could be misread, appearing to be longing or disappointment depending on who observed it. The ballroom claimed to celebrate elegance, but beneath its glittering facade lay a terrain shaped by silent risks. Every gesture carved a small path, and each path led to outcomes dancers struggled to fully control. People left the room believing they had navigated it well, unaware that one unnoticed detail might be shaping the conversations that awaited them the next morning. The night appeared effortless, yet each small motion carried consequences that stretched far beyond the dance floor. The silence within the room held more judgment than any spoken word could express. Somewhere amid the polished steps, one misplaced gesture was already waiting to unravel a carefully guarded reputation. The dance card rested lightly in a woman's hand, but the weight it imposed shaped the entire rhythm of the evening. It appeared harmless at first glance, a small booklet made of stiff paper decorated with modest ribbons, its pages lined with spaces waiting to be filled. Yet within those narrow lines lay a structure that governed movement, choice, and reputation. Every woman entering the ballroom understood that the card was not a simple record. It was a quiet instrument of control that dictated who she met, how long she met them, and what others would conclude from those choices. A dance card organized the night into measured segments. Each piece of music corresponded to a line on the page, and each line demanded a name. Leaving it blank suggested carelessness or worse, rejection. Filling it hastily suggested desperation. The goal was to strike the balance expected of someone raised to navigate the ballroom, without error, selective but not aloof, sociable yet restrained. Women learned this balance long before they reached adulthood. They practiced neat handwriting, so their cards looked orderly. They memorized which dances were appropriate for certain acquaintances. Nothing about the card was optional. Watching a woman fill her card revealed more about her position within the room than any amount of conversation. Men approached at deliberate intervals, stepping forward just long enough to request a particular dance. Some names were written without hesitation, the pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Others were added with a pause, signaling uncertainty. A request declined, rarely needed words. A polite smile and a slight shift of the hand over the card communicated enough. The men understood these cues even when they pretended otherwise. A single omission, even when accidental, could trigger quite friction. If two men sought the same dance, and one found his name absent, while the other's was written clearly, the imbalance echoed long after the music faded. Families noticed. Observers along the walls noticed. The woman herself became a subject of speculation, not because she had done anything improper, but because the card exposed patterns no one could conceal. People read the sequence of names as if decoding a message, forming conclusions before the night had even reached its midpoint. The structure extended beyond personal preference. Unwritten rules dictated which men should appear on which lines. A man of higher standing offered his request early in the evening. Declining him risked offense. A man of lesser status requested the later dances. Accepting them too readily suggested misplaced interest. Some dances carried more significance than others. The waltz, with its closeness and steady rotations, implied a level of familiarity not granted lightly. A quadrille or a country dance felt safer, signaling formality rather than intimacy. The card transformed these distinctions into a schedule that everyone pretended was natural. Families treated the card as evidence of progress. Mothers hovered discreetly near the edges of the room, pretending to admire the music while glancing repeatedly at their daughters' hands. A card filled too slowly stirred anxiety. A card filled too quickly raised suspicion. Even the order of names mattered. Certain pairings were encouraged, others quietly discouraged, and all of them were scrutinized when the dancers regrouped between sets. The card became an unspoken report card, revealing success or failure without ever needing to be spoken aloud. Men navigated the same system with equal caution. Asking too few partners suggested indifference. Asking too many suggested lack of discipline. Their names, once written on a woman's card, tied them to her for the length of a dance and to whatever interpretation others formed. A man who appeared repeatedly on the same woman's card attracted immediate attention. A man whose name vanished from expected places became a subject of whispers. The card held them accountable even when they believed they were acting freely. Beyond the social choreography, the card functioned as a clock. It broke the evening into fixed intervals, ensuring that no one lingered too long with a single partner. People moved as scheduled, shifting from dance to dance with mechanical efficiency. Even those who felt the pressure of the night tightening around them continued forward, guided by the lines they had written earlier. The room appeared graceful, but the rhythm underneath resembled the ticking of a mechanism wound too tightly. Not everyone managed the system well. Some newcomers underestimated the complexity and filled their cards without considering the implications. Others hesitated too long, leaving blank spaces that sparked curiosity they had not intended. A few ignored the rules altogether, attempting to choose based on personal preference rather than expectation. These individuals often found themselves quietly excluded from future invitations. The ballroom forgave nearly anything, except ignorance of its structure. By the time the music slowed and the final pages of the card were filled, the night's impressions had already been formed. Families compared observations. Men reconsidered their choices. Women reread the names written in their own careful script, knowing that each one might affect conversations in the days ahead. The card, though small, had shaped relationships, guided alliances, and exposed hidden tensions with a clarity that no one openly acknowledged. The card seemed delicate, yet it reached farther than any spoken plan within the room. The names written upon it carried meanings that outlasted the music itself. Within those narrow lines, an unexpected pairing had already begun to shift the quiet balance of the season. Inside the ballroom, an appearance of openness lingered in the air. Yet the reality within those walls was shaped by boundaries drawn long before the first guest arrived. These gatherings followed an unspoken hierarchy that determined not only who could enter, but how each person was permitted to exist once inside. The chandeliers shone across polished floors, casting equal light on everyone present, but the meaning of that light shifted, depending on who stood beneath it. Some guests were welcomed into full visibility, others remained deliberately concealed along the edges. People of color held no place in these rooms. Even those employed by the households hosting the event were required to slip away before the first notes of the music began. They arranged flowers, adjusted decorations, swept dust from corners, and ensured the ballroom looked untouched by anything outside its gilded doors. Yet when elegance was ready to be displayed, they stepped aside into narrow hallways or behind heavy curtains, listening distantly to the celebration they were not permitted to witness. Their absence was not incidental. It preserved the illusion of purity that the upper classes clung to so tightly. Servants belonging to the hosting family were treated only slightly differently. They moved along the edges of the event, careful never to draw attention. Their steps were measured, their gestures minimal. They delivered refreshments, collected used glasses, and monitored the candles that lined the walls. But they did so with the quiet precision of people who had been trained to disappear. The ballroom accepted their work, but not their presence. Any mistake, any misstep, any accidental brush against a guest risked harsh reprimand. People from the working class were not considered at all. Their labor sustained the wealth of the individuals who filled the room, yet they themselves remained permanently outside its reach. They might walk past the windows on their way home from long hours of labor, catching only fragments of music drifting upward, but entry into such a space was never an option. Even with the appropriate attire, their speech, posture, or mannerisms would expose them instantly. The ballroom accepted wealth, but it demanded lineage above all else. Entire families were quietly excluded, sometimes for reasons so old that no one remembered the original incident. A rumor carried forward from another generation, a scandal involving a distant relative, or a poorly regarded business partnership, could leave a family permanently removed from guest lists. No official justification was needed. Silence enforced the exclusion more effectively than any formal rule ever could. Daughters raised in these families understood that no amount of preparation would bring them into the ballroom's inner circle. Sons accepted that opportunities extended to others would never reach them. Colonial families occupied a complicated position. Their resources allowed them entry, yet their origins kept them at a distance. They stood in rooms they technically had access to, but their place within them was never secure. Guests greeted them with polite courtesy, admiring their clothing, and asking mild questions about their travels, yet rarely inviting any meaningful connection. Their daughters stood beneath the same chandeliers as everyone else, wearing gowns tailored just as finely, but a subtle distance followed them. The distinction was quiet, but unrelenting. These layers of exclusion revealed themselves not through declarations, but through movement. Groups formed and dissolved with practiced ease, creating invisible borders that only insiders recognized fully. Some guests drifted effortlessly from circle to circle, their confidence reinforced by lineage. Others found themselves restricted to narrow portions of the room, allowed to participate only in superficial ways. Even those who pretended not to notice adjusted their behavior instinctively, avoiding associations that might cast doubt on their own standing. The dance floor mirrored these divisions. Certain pairings were encouraged as a matter of tradition and expectation. Others were discouraged without a single word being spoken. A young woman who accepted the wrong partner risked raising eyebrows. A man who crossed these unwritten lines could trigger murmurs that lasted well beyond the evening. Families monitored every combination of dancers, assessing what each pairing implied for reputation and future alliances. People excluded indirectly felt the weight of it more than anyone else. A colonial heiress standing alone for too long would sense the quiet calculation behind the glances cast in her direction. A wealthy merchant's son might straighten his posture or refine his manners, hoping to soften judgments that would not shift regardless of his efforts. The ballroom responded to pedigree, not performance. Pretending to fit in rarely altered the truth of who belonged. Despite the outward elegance, the ballroom thrived on division. Its brightness relied on careful selection, and its charm depended on the absence of anyone who challenged its structure. Those accepted within the walls rarely questioned the hierarchy. Those kept at a distance understood that resistance carried consequences. The room operated under rules no one needed to articulate because everyone already knew them. The ballroom looked unified, yet invisible borders divided every inch of the gathering. The hierarchy sustaining those borders remained unquestioned by those who benefited from it. Within that polished scene, a deeper form of hidden labor was preparing to reveal how much the ballroom depended on people no one ever acknowledged. Beneath the brightness of the ballroom, another world existed in narrow gaps between bodies beneath layers of fabric and behind half-open doors leading into shadowed corridors. This world belonged to the servants, mostly women, whose presence sustained the illusion of effortless beauty that others enjoyed. They were not invited as participants, nor welcomed as observers. They belonged to the quiet machinery of the evening, moving with practiced skill to maintain a surface that concealed everything beneath it. The female servants carried responsibilities that required near invisibility. They slipped through crowded spaces with movements honed by repetition, keeping their steps light enough to avoid disturbing conversations or drawing attention. Many carried small tools, needles, ribbons, pieces of lace tucked into aprons hidden under plain dresses. Their role was to correct mistakes before anyone else noticed them. A loose train of fabric dragging across the floor, a torn hem, a fallen hairpin, or a bead of sweat threatening to smudge powder on a woman's face, all summoned them instantly. They addressed these issues with swift and subtle gestures, restoring perfection before it had time to break. These tasks unfolded primarily in motion. A servant leaning in behind a woman's shoulder could adjust a gown in seconds, her hands moving silently while the woman continued her conversation, as though nothing had happened. Another might wipe perspiration discreetly from the back of a gentleman's glove, ensuring no trace of discomfort marred his composure. Servants perfected the art of operating without interruption, offering assistance without acknowledgement. Their success depended on remaining unseen. When the ballroom grew too crowded, servants used the narrowest spaces available, pressing into tight channels between bodies, or stepping momentarily behind columns draped with fabric that brushed their faces as they passed. Yet they kept pace with the event, always positioned where an emergency might unfold. A broken clasp, a twisted ankle, or a spilled drink required immediate response. Their awareness extended beyond sight. They listened for the shift in tone, or the drop in a dancer's rhythm that signaled something had gone wrong. Those stationed in the dark corridors lived at the edge of sound and light. They stood along the passageways that connected the ballroom to kitchens, storage rooms, or private chambers. These halls smelled of wax and fabric, warmed by the constant movement of bodies, yet left without decoration. From there, servants anticipated requests before they were spoken. They passed water towels, hairpins, spare gloves, and replacement fans through barely opened doors. They waited for signals, subtle knocks whispered, caused the flicker of a shadow, and responded with precision. Their tasks remained invisible to the guests, who rarely questioned how the evening continued so smoothly. Some servants knew the ballroom better than the guests themselves. They memorized the rhythm of dances, the order of interactions, and the personalities that governed the night. They saw which couples moved with genuine ease and which strained to maintain appearances. They recognized signs of anxiety before anyone else trembling. Fingers hidden beneath gloves, shallow breaths caused by tightly laced corsets, or the stiff posture of someone forcing themselves to endure the moment. Servants read these details with clarity because their work depended on knowing what others ignored. Despite their proximity to everything, servants were treated as though they occupied a different existence. Guests avoided eye contact, stepping around them without acknowledgement, as though the evening unfolded magically, without human intervention. The ballroom's elegance demanded that the labor supporting it remain unmentioned, even though that labor shaped every moment of the event. Servants did not expect gratitude, but they understood that the room depended on them more than anyone admitted. Their invisibility granted them access to truths that others would never learn. While adjusting a hem, a servant might overhear a whispered argument disguised as polite conversation. While fetching water, she might witness a fleeting exchange of glances that contradicted public behavior. Servants observed the ambitions, insecurities, and contradictions of those around them with steady impartiality. They carried these observations silently, knowing that sharing them would risk their positions. Yet the knowledge remained, shaping their understanding of the ballroom far differently from those who danced inside it. Even exhaustion did not free them from their duties. Servants continued working long after the music softened and guests began drifting toward the exits. They collected discarded ribbons, smoothed wrinkled fabrics, gathered lost hairpins, and wiped away traces of the night from the floors. They carried the weight of the event until the ballroom returned to its earlier silence, lit only by the faint remnants of candlelight. While guests left with impressions shaped by alliances, dances, and social calculations, servants remained behind with a clearer picture, one that revealed the machinery beneath the surface. Their presence formed the quiet foundation of the entire evening. Without them, the illusion of effortless refinement would collapse. Yet their names were never recorded in dance cards, and their movements never echoed across the polished floors. The ballroom recognized only the faces invited into the light, not the hands working in the shadows. The event appeared flawless, yet every detail relied on those who moved unseen beneath its glow. The people in the shadows knew more about the ballroom than anyone permitted to dance. From that hidden labor emerged a quiet tension, already preparing to disturb the polished facade. Preparation for a ballroom evening began long before the first notes of music reached the polished floor. In many households, the tension settled into the rooms by late afternoon, growing heavier as the sun lowered, and the housemaids hurried between tasks. Young women waited in their chambers, aware that every detail of their appearance would soon be examined under the harsh clarity of chandeliers. The hours before the event were not filled with excitement, but with a quiet pressure that wrapped itself around them like a tightening band. Corsets formed the center of this ritual. They were tightened layer by layer, the laces pulled steadily until the young woman's breath thinned into short, controlled inhales. Standing still during the process required discipline. Though most felt the strain spreading up their ribs, long before the laces reached the final knot. The shape created by the corset mattered more than comfort. Families believed that elegance required sacrifice, and each breath, restricted and shallow, served as evidence of that principle. Many girls learned to endure the constriction without complaint, aware that any sign of discomfort might be interpreted as immaturity. Once the corset stiffened around their bodies, the work moved upward to the hair. This step demanded patience, precision, and an almost complete stillness. Hair was curled into rigid shapes pinned to maintain height, and coated with powders or sprays meant to secure the arrangement throughout the night. Each layer of styling added weight that pulled at the scalp. Hours passed in slow increments, as housemaids stepped back repeatedly to observe the shape-adjusting strands that refused to settle. The goal was not beauty alone, but durability. The hairstyle needed to survive dancing, sweating, and constant scrutiny. Some young women sat with tense shoulders as the hours accumulated. Their necks stiffened from holding a position that could not be altered. Even blinking too frequently risked disturbing the powder around their temples. The anticipation of the evening pressed harder with each moment, for they understood that the preparation did not end in the mirror. It extended into every gesture they would make once inside the ballroom. Any flaw remaining at the end of this process would follow them through the night. Dressing came next, adding layers of fabric that transformed the corseted body into the silhouette expected of a ballroom attendee. Skirts were arranged carefully to prevent folds or creases. Bodices were fastened with practiced hands. Gloves slid over fingers that had already begun to tingle from limited circulation. Shoes were tightened to ensure balance on polished floors. Each layer added another degree of constraint, making movement less natural and posture more demanding. The appearance created by these garments suggested ease, but the experience of wearing them required continuous restraint. Mistakes during this stage mattered greatly. A misplaced stitch, a small stain, or a poorly tied ribbon could draw attention in ways the wearer wished to avoid. Families understood this, and mothers often supervised every step with unwavering focus. They inspected hems, adjusted lace, and corrected even minor imperfections. A flaw that escaped attention in the afternoon could become the source of whispered amusement in the ballroom. A single wrinkle or misaligned bow might overshadow hours of preparation. People remembered these details longer than they remembered faces. The tension extended beyond appearance. Young women practiced their expression in the moments before leaving the house. They rehearsed the calm, composed smile expected of them. They checked their posture, arranging their shoulders to fall, just so ensuring no sign of strain showed through their movements. Even the way they held their hands was considered. Many learned to conceal trembling fingers by folding them lightly at their waist or adjusting the fall of their skirt. Appearance did not end with clothing. It continued through every controlled motion. Meanwhile, the atmosphere around them changed. Housemaids moved quickly, freeing pins from the floor, gathering loose ribbons, brushing lint from skirts. Fathers paced the hallway, adjusting cuffs. Mothers whispered reminders about etiquette and introductions. The entire household shifted into a quiet urgency, as though preparing for an examination. Every person present understood that the ballroom judged not only individuals but the families behind them. An error committed by a daughter reflected on her parents. A misstep or wardrobe failure might shape conversations that continued through the season. The carriage ride to the ballroom offered little relief. The movement of the wheels caused hair to shift, gowns to wrinkle, and thoughts to tighten. Young women sat as straight as their corsets allowed, careful not to disturb the work that had consumed the afternoon. Their breaths remained shallow, their expressions remained fixed. Even the anticipation of entering the brightly lit room brought no comfort. The hours of preparation pressed heavily upon them, reminding them that failure was possible long before success could ever be secured. By the time the carriage stopped at the entrance, the strain of the preparation had already become part of the evening. Every sensation, the stiffness of the corset, the weight of the hair, the tension in the shoulders, followed them into the ballroom. They stepped forward with the calm expected of them, though their bodies carried the burden of every adjustment made in the preceding hours. Few guests recognized the effort embedded in the appearance. They saw only the result, a polished figure meant to glide through the event, without betraying the hours of discomfort behind her. The night began long before music touched the ballroom, shaped by labor that left no visible trace. The quiet pressure of preparation settled deeper than the layers of fabric worn into the room. Out of that accumulated strain rose a fragility waiting to be tested beneath the bright scrutiny of the evening. Inside the ballroom, people often described the scene as dazzling, filled with shimmering fabrics, polished shoes, and carefully composed smiles. Yet beneath that surface, the air itself carried a weight that few acknowledged openly. The room, crowded beyond comfort, trapped heat and scent in a space with little ventilation. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere thickened, pressing against the dancers with an intensity that grew harder to ignore. Despite the chandeliers and the gleaming mirrors, the air remained a reminder of the body's presence beneath every layer of silk. Heat accumulated quickly. Dozens of dancers moved through, set after set, their breath shallow from corsets, their skin damp beneath heavy clothing. With each rotation of the waltz or the steady pace of a quadrille, the temperature inside the ballroom rose. The candles burning along the walls contributed their own warmth, creating pockets of air that clung to the dancers as they passed. Some tried to remain composed, adjusting their posture to appear unaffected, but the strain revealed itself in the slight sheen along their temples, or the way they paused longer than necessary between dances. Sweat mixed into the crowd in ways no one could avoid. Even the most practiced dancers felt moisture gathering beneath gloves, around collars or along the edges of tightly fitted sleeves. The effort to maintain perfect form made the situation more difficult. Movements had to remain graceful, expressions calm and breathing steady, even as the air felt increasingly heavy. Attempts to mask the discomfort only magnified it. Guests continued smiling, but their eyes betrayed the tension of enduring heat that showed no sign of easing. The fragrances added another layer to the confined space. Perfumes were chosen for strength rather than subtlety, created from oils meant to persist through long evenings. Their intensity, pleasant at first, soon grew overwhelming. Men applied colognes with sharp notes that clung to their coats. Women wore powders scented with floral oils, each formulated to compete with the natural odors of crowded gatherings. These fragrances mingled until no single scent could be distinguished. Instead, they formed a dense cloud that hovered over the dancers. Chemical powders used on faces, shoulders, and hair contributed their own sharpness to the mixture. The heat caused some powders to loosen, drifting faintly into the air with each movement. Polished floors, continuously warmed by constant footsteps, released a faint smell of wax. Even the stiff fabrics used in gowns and coats carried their own odors released gradually as the material softened under the pressure of body heat. All these elements blended into an atmosphere that contradicted the elegance presented on the surface. Some guests struggled quietly with the intensity. Women felt perspiration gathering along the edges of their corsets, trapped against skin that could not breathe beneath layers of fabric. Men wiped their brows discreetly with gloved hands, careful not to smudge powder or leave visible moisture behind. A few stepped toward open doorways, pretending interest in conversation, while seeking the slightest draft of cooler air. Servants attempted to manage the conditions, with subtle adjustments, opening a door for a moment, pulling back a curtain, but any relief disappeared as soon as more dancers filled the space. Certain women prepared for these conditions with a method passed discreetly through households, a handkerchief soaked in essential oils. They kept the cloth folded inside gloves or hidden in small purses, raising it to their faces at calculated intervals. The oils masked the surrounding scent just enough to offer relief. Lavender rose and bergamot were common choices, though some preferred sharper notes like peppermint. These handkerchiefs served as a quiet shield, allowing their users to continue dancing without revealing discomfort. Not everyone could rely on such measures. Some women found the intensity of fragrance and heat impossible to ignore, yet they were expected to maintain composure at all times. A flushed face or a visible sign of distress risked becoming a topic of conversation. Men, too, endured the conditions silently, knowing that stepping away too frequently created the appearance of weakness. The pressure to remain poised outweighed the physical strain imposed by the room. Despite the discomfort, the crowd continued moving with practiced elegance. Music drifted through the haze of scent, guiding dancers who fought to keep their posture intact. The room seemed determined to hold its image of refinement, even as the physical reality beneath it grew increasingly challenging. The effort to maintain the illusion required constant self-control from everyone present. Observers along the edges of the room witnessed subtle signs of fatigue. They noticed the stiffness in dancers' shoulders, the slight wobble of a step, or the way a glove was adjusted to absorb moisture. Yet no one spoke of these things. To acknowledge the physical strain risked breaking the illusion of the ballroom's perfection. Instead, guests lifted their chins, adjusted their expressions, and pretended the air around them remained light and pleasant. When the evening ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, the weight of the room lingered behind. The floors retained the warmth of countless footsteps. Scents clung to curtains and to the walls. Servants opened windows to release the accumulated air, revealing just how thick the atmosphere had become. Only then did the illusion of refinement begin to fade, replaced by the unmistakable evidence of bodies that had struggled quietly beneath layers of expectation. Elegance defined the ballroom, yet the air around the dancers told a different story. The weight of scent and heat revealed the strain no one dared to mention aloud. Under that heavy atmosphere lay a truth waiting to surface, shaped by the unspoken rules governing how guests navigated one another. Among the women who entered the ballroom, expectations extended far beyond the formal etiquette taught at home. Hidden rules governed their interactions, shaping every choice from dress to movement. These rules had no written form, yet everyone understood them. They helped determine who advanced socially, who remained unnoticed, and who risked becoming the subject of quiet ridicule. While the ballroom appeared unified under light and music, women navigated it through a system defined as much by silence as by observation. Color played a significant role in this landscape. Women avoided wearing gowns that matched the color worn by someone of higher status. Selecting the wrong shade could imply a challenge or an inappropriate attempt to draw attention. Many prepared their outfits carefully, analyzing trends and predicting what others might wear. Housemaids double-checked fabrics in lamplight, comparing tones to ensure no resemblance might offend. These efforts often intensified in households where reputation felt fragile, for a single mistake could mark a woman for the remainder of the season. Within this system, brighter colors were handled with caution. Bold shades belonged primarily to those with established positions or wealth. Women of lesser rank chose muted tones, accepting the limitation as a way to avoid conflict. They understood that the ballroom judged not only how they looked, but also how they positioned themselves relative to others. Even something as simple as standing too close to a woman of higher status while wearing a similarly striking gown could prompt whispered comments. Rules extended into the framework of dance. While dance cards guided the evening's structure, unwritten limits determined how frequently a woman might dance with the same man. 1 or 2 dances signaled polite interest. Anything beyond that risked drawing attention, suggesting intentions considered too forward for the context. Women who ignored this boundary found themselves observed more closely for the remainder of the night. Their movements, conversations, and interactions became subjects of speculation. The enforcement of these rules came through social observation rather than confrontation. Women positioned themselves along the edges of the room, watching the patterns unfold. They noted which pairs danced more than expected, which women lingered too near certain men, or who received an unusual amount of attention. These observations became quiet assessments, carried out with an expressionless calm that concealed the intensity beneath. The ballroom never lacked eyes trained to detect breaches of etiquette. Speech also carried its own boundaries. A woman who spoke extensively with another woman's husband risked accusations of overfamiliarity. Even a harmless conversation could appear suspicious if prolonged. Men rarely faced equal scrutiny. The burden fell mostly on women who bore responsibility for preserving appearances. Any deviation, intentional or not, could be taken as a slight against another household. These unspoken expectations shaped every exchange, limiting how freely women could move or interact. The consequences of violating these hidden rules often appeared gradually. A woman who made a misstep might notice others responding with polite distance. Invitations could grow less frequent. Greetings might shift in tone, becoming cooler or shorter. Word spread quickly among the guests, though rarely through explicit statements. Instead, impressions passed from one observer to another until they settled into shared understanding. A single evening's error could shadow a woman for weeks. For many, navigating these rules required constant awareness. They monitored their clothing, their posture, and their proximity to others. They kept track of which women held higher social standing, adjusting their behavior accordingly. Even the placement of a fan or the way they held their gloves mattered in conversations shaped by subtle signals. Their attention extended across the room, assessing situations that might appear surface level but held deeper significance within their circle. The pressure intensified for young women newly introduced into society. They learned quickly that smiles needed to be calculated and gestures restrained. Some arrived with careful instruction from mothers or aunts who remembered their own missteps. Others learned by observing how older women carried themselves, taking note of what drew admiration and what drew criticism. The ballroom served as both an arena and a classroom, teaching them that social success required discipline as much as grace. Despite the quiet tension underlying these interactions, the environment never appeared outwardly hostile. Women maintained the veneer of politeness expected of them. They greeted one another with practiced warmth, exchanged compliments, and moved through the room as though unified by the event. Yet, beneath the surface, each woman maintained her own calculations, measuring risk and opportunity with every step. The equilibrium held because everyone participated in preserving it, even when it restricted them. These rules also shaped alliances. Women who managed to maintain modesty, elegance, and careful restraint earned respect from peers. Those who displayed arrogance or recklessness found themselves quietly isolated. The system functioned on subtle reinforcement rather than open confrontation, yet its effects carried real weight. Families followed the outcomes, closely aware that a daughter's standing in the ballroom influenced her prospects beyond it. In the end, the ballroom operated according to these hidden expectations, just as much as it relied on music or dance. The women who occupied its space understood that their presence required more than attire and posture. It demanded an awareness of boundaries, an ability to interpret signals, and a willingness to submit to rules that shaped their public identity. The elegance seen by others existed because of the quiet vigilance practiced by every woman in the room. Social harmony appeared effortless, yet it depended on rules understood without being spoken. The space between dancers held expectations stronger than any written code. Out of that fragile balance drifted a tension waiting to surface when ambition and caution met. Beneath the sound of violins and the smooth rotation of dancers, The ballroom carried its own undercurrent, quiet, persistent, and shaped by more than music. The waltz, admired for its elegance, also created moments of closeness that blurred boundaries. People spoke of the dance as refined, but many understood what it allowed: brief contact, shared breath, and guarded emotions drifting too close to visibility. While the steps appeared disciplined, the space between partners held possibilities that families preferred not to acknowledge. A waltz required partners to stand nearer than any other dance permitted, their hands lined together, their shoulders aligned, their bodies moving in matched rhythm. The closeness lingered for the length of the music, long enough for impressions to form. A man's hand resting slightly too long at a woman's waist, or a woman leaning a fraction closer than etiquette allowed, carried weight in a room where every gesture faced observation. Guests, who watched from the edges, noticed such details with steady attention. The ballroom treated these cues with significance. A dance that drifted into an intimacy beyond expectation signaled something deeper, whether intentional or accidental. Women, aware of the risk, moved with disciplined restraint, ensuring distance even when the music encouraged closeness. Men sometimes tested the limits, guiding their partners with softer pressure or drawing them into a tighter turn. Some women subtly resisted, while others hesitated, unsure whether the gesture marked admiration, misjudgment, or something more calculated. Rumors often grew from these silent moments. Observers noted how long a pair lingered after a dance, how slowly they separated, or whether their eyes met again when they believed no one watched. Whispered interpretations took shape quietly, forming suggestions not spoken aloud, but carried from one household to another. Scandal rarely erupted immediately. Instead, it built gradually, shaped by repeated impressions that pointed toward a pattern rather than a single event. The risks extended further than a damaged reputation. Some relationships born from the waltz crossed boundaries that families considered dangerous. Young women unfamiliar with the subtleties of the ballroom sometimes misread intention as affection. A glance exchanged during a dance could linger in their minds long after the music stopped. Men, more experienced in navigating these settings occasionally, used the closeness of the waltz to encourage illusions they did not plan to honor. It was not uncommon for misinterpretations to grow into expectations that one side never intended to fulfill. Pregnancy, though rarely acknowledged publicly, cast a long shadow across these possibilities. In certain cases, a private exchange during a dance marked the beginning of a secret relationship. It might progress through hidden meetings or letters delivered discreetly, with the woman believing the connection sincere. If the relationship deepened, consequences followed. When a young woman's condition became apparent, families scrambled to contain the situation. Marriages were arranged hastily, or when no arrangement could be secured, the woman disappeared from social life entirely. Families spoke of illness or travel, but the truth circulated in quiet assumptions. Some women did not return after the season ended. Their absence left a hollow space, unspoken but unmistakable. Servants who observed more than most sometimes cleaned rooms that had been emptied quickly, leaving behind faint traces of perfume or a dress left unintentionally folded. Guests who asked casually after these women received short answers and changed topics. The disappearance signaled that something had gone wrong, and that the family had chosen silence over explanation. Men involved in such events rarely bore consequences. They remained in the ballroom, continuing to dance and socialize as though nothing had happened. Their reputations remained secure, protected by wealth status and the assumption that responsibility belonged elsewhere. Women, however, carried the burden of secrecy, fear, and loss. Their departures became part of an unspoken history the ballroom preferred to ignore. Even those who avoided scandal felt the threat of it nearby. The pressure to maintain composure heightened during each waltz. Women entered the dance with controlled breath, careful to maintain exact posture. They avoided meeting their partner's eyes for too long. They measured their distance and guarded their expression. They understood that misinterpretation could arise from something as simple as a slight change in rhythm or moment of imbalance. The ballroom's expectations created an emotional stillness that contrasted sharply with the elegance suggested by the music. Observers along the walls learned to read these signs. They watched how a woman's shoulders shifted, how her partner held her hand, and how their steps aligned. They detected hesitation or eagerness with practiced precision. The dance functioned as a quiet test, revealing patterns invisible in other parts of the evening. As music carried the dancers forward, the watchers constructed narratives beneath the swirling shapes on the floor. After the waltz ended, the atmosphere often changed. Some pairs are separated with an almost mechanical formality. Others lingered adjusting gloves or smoothing skirts in a way that suggested they needed a moment to steady themselves. Men sometimes offered polite bows that masked a trace of intention. Women returned them with expressions that hid uncertainty. Every detail became another piece of quiet evidence for those who observed. By the end of the night, the ballroom contained dozens of such moments, none spoken aloud, none forgotten. The waltz revealed possibilities that few dared name, yet its consequences shaped reputations long after the music faded. The dance remained central to the ballroom's rhythm, even as it carried risks that everyone recognized but pretended not to see. Closeness shaped the waltz, yet its dangers settled quietly beneath each measured step. The patterns formed across the floor lingered long after dancers released one another's hands. In the wake of that fragile nearness rose stories waiting to be heard when silence began to thin. The elegance seen inside the ballroom often concealed a level of physical strain that few acknowledged. Beneath the polished surface of gowns and measured steps, young women endured discomfort that shaped every moment of the evening. Their poise hid marks and bruises carried beneath the fabric injuries created long before they set foot on the floor. The image they presented did not reflect the effort required to maintain it, nor the quiet endurance that allowed the night to continue without interruption. Corsets played a central role in this unseen burden. Their rigid structure pressed into the skin, creating deep lines that darkened into bruises as the hours passed. The pressure did not ease. It remained consistent, binding the ribs and abdomen in a way that restricted breath. Some young women learned to inhale slowly, keeping their movements controlled to avoid dizziness. Others pressed gloved hands against their sides when no one watched, attempting to steady themselves. The marks left by the corset lasted long after the evening ended, faint reminders of the cost of maintaining an acceptable silhouette. The bruises varied depending on the shape of the corset. Some appeared as narrow ridges along the ribs. Others formed broad, shadowed areas across the waist, where the fabric tightened most. Servants who helped women undress after the event sometimes paused when they saw the depth of these marks. Yet the next afternoon, the same process began again, repeated with the same precision. The priority was always appearance, even when the tightening cut into the skin. The shoes added another layer of discomfort. Designed to complement gowns rather than support movement, they pressed against the toes and heels with unyielding stiffness. Many women experienced numbness in their feet before the first hour ended. Still, they continued dancing, stepping carefully to minimize pain while maintaining the posture expected of them. The polished floor of the ballroom offered little relief. Instead, the smooth surface made each movement more deliberate, intensifying the pressure inside the narrow shoes. By the end of the night, the skin beneath these shoes often showed signs of strain, redness, swelling, or patches where the material had rubbed the surface raw. Younger women, new to the demands of the ballroom, sometimes struggled to hide their discomfort. They shifted their weight subtly, attempting to relieve pressure without breaking the illusion of control. Observers rarely noticed such details, focusing instead on the outward elegance that the dancers worked so hard to project. Breath played a critical role in the overall strain. The combination of tight corsets, crowded rooms, and continuous movement created conditions that challenged even those accustomed to such events. Some women felt lightheaded during the dances, their vision blurring briefly as their lungs fought for space. They adjusted their posture, lifting their shoulders slightly to allow for shallow breaths. Others pressed forward despite the signs of faintness, unwilling to step away and risk attracting attention. Occasionally, the strain became impossible to hide. A young woman might sway unexpectedly during a turn or pause too long between steps. Her partner steadied her with a subtle movement, helping her reach the edge of the floor where she could stand still for a moment. In more serious cases, women collapsed their bodies, giving in to the lack of oxygen. Servants responded immediately, guiding them towards side rooms where they could rest away from the eyes of the guests. These incidents were addressed quietly, treated as unavoidable accidents rather than evidence of the physical demands imposed by the evening. Families rarely discussed these challenges. Mothers who had endured the same strain in their youth offered short reminders about posture or breathing, but avoided acknowledging the pain. The focus remained on the presentation, the appearance of ease, the smoothness of movement, and the composure expected of a woman in society. Pain had no place in the ballroom's image. The injuries were temporary, they said, and therefore acceptable. Despite the expectation of resilience, many women carried traces of these evenings long after they ended. Bruises from corsets lingered for days, pressing reminders into the skin each time they dressed. The soreness in their feet persisted, making simple tasks uncomfortable. Some learned to hide their wincing when stepping out of bed the next morning. The ballroom demanded that their struggle remain invisible. Observers watching from the edges of the room seldom recognized how much discipline the dancers required. They saw only the final result: straight posture, balanced steps, and controlled expressions. They did not see the tremors that passed through a dancer's arm or the faint tightening of her jaw as she endured another measure of music. The beauty admired by those in attendance existed because of the effort that remained concealed beneath it. The night ended with applause, laughter, and the sound of carriages waiting outside. But the women who participated carried away more than memories of dance. They carried the marks of the evening, literal impressions pressed into the body by the expectations of society. As the lights dimmed and the room emptied, the ballroom revealed nothing of this returning to silence, as though the night's effort had never occurred. Elegance shaped the dancers, yet their bodies bore the evidence of every hidden strain. The calm seen on the surface hid discomfort that deepened with each measured step. After the final notes dissolved into silence, the reminder that beauty in the ballroom rested on endurance few acknowledged. Inside the ballroom, the sound of music and the steady movement of dancers often concealed purposes that extended far beyond celebration. The noble families who organized these gatherings understood that a ballroom offered more than entertainment. It provided a controlled space where conversations could unfold under the cover of music, where alliances could be tested, and where intentions could be measured without direct declaration. The refinement displayed on the surface did not erase the complexity beneath it. For many guests, attendance carried responsibilities shaped by family expectations. Those with influence used their presence to reinforce relationships. Those seeking advantage approached the evening with careful calculation. The ballroom became an informal arena in which political interests intertwined with social etiquette. Every greeting, bow, and exchange of glances carried meaning. Beneath the chandeliers, people observed one another with quiet precision, identifying which alliances remained firm and which ones seemed ready to shift. Marriage negotiations played a central role in these gatherings. Families seeking to strengthen their position arranged encounters between their children and potential matches. These interactions rarely took place openly. Instead, they were orchestrated through subtle guidance, an introduction at the right moment, a dance offered at the right time, or a conversation shaped to reveal compatible goals. While the young participants moved politely through these activities, the decisions formed around them shaped their futures long before they understood the nature of the choices being made. The music offered cover for these negotiations. As dancers moved across the floor, individuals along the edges engaged in conversations that appeared innocuous, but carried significance for those involved. A comment about land, a remark about trade, or a hint of concern about another family's actions signaled shifting priorities. Listeners responded with measured words, careful to avoid revealing too much, while still suggesting openness to cooperation. The ballroom encouraged this manner of communication, quiet, indirect, and wrapped in formality. Wine further softened the edges of these exchanges. Guests holding glasses near the refreshment tables often used the moment to speak more freely, though still within the limits of propriety. The warmth of the drink eased hesitation without undermining restraint. Observers understood that these conversations mattered as much as the formal meetings held elsewhere. Decisions formed in the presence of music and movement could be clarified later, but their initial direction often began here. Behind each dance lay the possibility of negotiation. The pairing of partners provided an opportunity to gauge compatibility, assess family status, or evaluate underlying intentions. A man offering his hand to a particular woman signaled interest not only in her, but in the alliances tied to her household. A woman accepting such an invitation indicated that her family was willing to entertain the possibility. While the dancers focused on their steps, the watchers noted these details with care. Some dances carried more weight than others. A waltz shared between influential families could suggest an alignment of interests. A refusal offered politely but firmly indicated conflict or disapproval. The ballroom transformed these gestures into a language understood by everyone present. Guests interpreted patterns, compared impressions, and adjusted their strategies accordingly. The decisions made through these exchanges influenced matters far beyond the ballroom walls. The presence of servants also contributed quietly to this atmosphere. Though instructed not to listen, they moved through the room with a sensitivity to tone and posture. Their observations, shared discreetly in servant quarters, revealed tensions unnoticed by the guests themselves. They recognized when two families avoided one another, when whispers carried urgency, or when an unexpected pairing suggested the beginning of a shift in influence. These details created another layer of understanding beneath the already complex social environment. Not all negotiations progressed smoothly. Some families pressed their ambitions too strongly, creating discomfort or suspicion. Others hesitated, delaying decisions that others hoped to finalize. The ballroom could amplify these tensions. A glance avoided, a bow shortened, or a conversation cut abruptly signaled divisions more clearly than any spoken disagreement. Guests attuned to the subtleties of the event recognized these signs immediately. Despite the complexity, outward harmony remained the expectation. People smiled, danced, and maintained the appearance of unity even when underlying interests clashed. They adhered to etiquette with meticulous care, presenting a controlled front that concealed the negotiations unfolding within the room. Only those accustomed to reading beneath the surface understood how much of the evening depended on these hidden agendas. When the music slowed and the last dances neared their end, many decisions had already begun to take shape. Families departed with new impressions, some hopeful, others uncertain. The event served its purpose not through formal declarations, but through the silent agreements formed in shared glances, measured conversations, and carefully chosen interactions. As the ballroom emptied, no evidence remained of these negotiations, yet they continued to influence decisions long afterward. The chandeliers dimmed, leaving only the faint glow reflected in polished floors. Servants began restoring order, unaware of the alliances and tensions that had shifted around them. The beauty of the room returned to stillness, hiding the complexity of the evening beneath its unbroken surface. Politics rarely appeared in the open, yet its presence shaped every movement inside the ballroom. Conversations wrapped in courtesy carried intentions that stretched far beyond the evening. Once the room settled into silence, lingered the sense that each dance had carried agreements waiting to be revealed. The ballroom operated under a structure that extended beyond music and dance. Etiquette shaped the interactions in ways that determined how each person moved, stood, and acknowledged others. These rules, learned through repetition rather than written instruction, defined one's place in the hierarchy more clearly than the clothing worn or the family name spoken. Those who entered the room carried these expectations with them, aware that even a moment's lapse could alter how others perceived them for the remainder of the season. Introductions formed the foundation of this system. The order in which people were presented revealed their standing relative to one another. A woman of higher rank never introduced herself. Others were brought forward to her. Men approached according to their position, mindful of who should speak first. Failure to respect this order appeared as disrespect, even if unintentional. Observers along the walls noted any deviations, storing the information quietly for later discussion. The ballroom remembered these mistakes long after music drowned them out. Bowing and curtsying followed a similarly rigid pattern. The angle, duration, and timing of these gestures carried specific meaning. A bow held too briefly suggested impatience. A curtsy executed too deeply could imply subservience out of place for the individual performing it. Everyone worked to maintain a precise balance, responding to one another, with movements shaped by long practice. Servants watching from the edges knew these rituals better than some guests, having witnessed countless variations of the same gestures. Passing through doorways and navigating crowded paths required its own discipline. The person of higher rank always moved first. Those of lesser standing stepped aside, offering a narrow shift of the shoulders that signaled recognition of difference. These small actions occurred repeatedly throughout the night, even when the room grew dense with dancers. To ignore these rules risked immediate judgment. People who failed to yield at the proper moment became subjects of glances and murmured comments. The training behind these rituals often began in early childhood. Families with social ambition ensured their daughters practiced posture, gestures, and expressions daily. They learned how to place their hands, how long to remain still during an introduction, and how to maintain a neutral expression when unexpected situations arose. Young men received similar instruction in the controlled movements expected of them. By the time they reached the ballroom, they knew that etiquette functioned almost like a coordinated drill. Errors revealed a lack of preparation, while flawless execution showed discipline. Despite the strictness of these rules, the ballroom did not announce them. Guests absorbed the expectations through observation, mimicking the behaviors of those above them. This process created an unspoken hierarchy reinforced through movement. A woman who curtsied with perfect precision demonstrated control over her position. A man who stepped aside at exactly the right moment signaled understanding of his surroundings. These details formed the foundation of social order inside the room. Mistakes, however small, attracted attention quickly. A misplaced bow or a curtsy, directed at the wrong individual, marked a person immediately. Others noticed the lapse exchanged, brief looks, and filed the information away. Conversations later in the night often circled back to these incidents through discreet remarks. While no one addressed the errors openly, their impact stretched beyond the evening. Invitations might grow fewer, greetings might become colder, reputation shifted, quietly shaped by the memory of a gesture executed improperly. Watching these interactions required attention to posture, movement, and subtle shifts of expression. Observers understood that people revealed their comfort or discomfort through the smallest actions. Someone unfamiliar with the rules moved with a slight hesitation. Someone eager to impress exaggerated their gestures. Someone confident maintained stillness and control. The ballroom offered no forgiveness for nervousness. The more tightly structured the ritual, the more visible any deviation became. Even those accustomed to these expectations sometimes felt the strain. Holding one's posture for hours caused stiffness that spread through the back and shoulders. Maintaining a composed expression while monitoring the room required constant focus. People spent more energy managing their presence than enjoying the evening. Yet they continued because the ballroom demanded such discipline. It was understood that belonging required effort. The ritual expanded into interactions beyond greetings. Raising a glass, accepting a dance, or stepping aside for another person followed rules that reflected status and intention. A woman declining a dance offered a specific movement of her hand and a controlled expression that conveyed refusal without insult. A man approaching someone of a higher rank initiated contact with careful distance. Every action reinforced the structure of the evening, maintaining order even as the room grew crowded. As the night progressed, these gestures accumulated into a portrait of the social order. People who moved with confidence maintained their positions. Those who faltered found themselves quietly repositioned. The ballroom functioned as a system of constant evaluation, though no one spoke of it directly. Conversations at the edges revealed observations masked as casual remarks. The rituals acted as both performance and test, measuring how well each person upheld expectations set long before they arrived. By the time the final dance approached, the weight of etiquette had settled into everyone's posture. The room appeared orderly, but beneath that order lay exhaustion from maintaining precision for so many hours. Guests left the ballroom, aware that their actions had been observed and interpreted. The rules would follow them into the next gathering, shaping how others approached them and how opportunities unfolded. Etiquette guided every step, yet its purpose reached far beyond simple courtesy. The smallest gesture revealed more than spoken words, shaping impressions that lasted long after the night ended. After the lights dimmed, lingered the knowledge that each movement had been measured with silent scrutiny. Among the well-dressed crowds filling the ballroom, there existed a group of women whose presence was not shaped by opportunity but by necessity. They were invited not for social promise, not for alliances, and not for admiration. They appeared because the room needed bodies to complete its appearance. These women, often from families with limited means, stepped into the ballroom, carrying the knowledge that their purpose differed from that of everyone around them. While others sought partners' conversations and attention, they were expected to remain still understated and unnoticed. Placement within the room revealed their position immediately. They were guided toward the walls, standing in a narrow line between the polished floor and the heavy curtains. Their gowns, chosen deliberately in dark colors, blended into the shadows. Families instructed them to avoid shades that might draw curiosity or challenge the brightness of wealthier guests. The muted fabric signaled restraint, ensuring that their presence supported the room rather than disturbed it. They understood these expectations before arriving. Mothers reminded them to keep their posture straight, to smile lightly when approached, and to remain calm even when ignored. The instructions shaped their entire evening. They entered the ballroom with controlled steps, stopping at the designated edges of the space, where their presence would fill the gaps, without influencing the movement of others. Their stillness contrasted sharply with the constant rotation of dancers passing before them. Throughout the night, these women relied on quiet endurance. They watched the pairs moving across the floor, observed the patterns forming between families, and listened to the music without participating. Their gloved hands rested at their sides or folded discreetly at their waists. They avoided shifting too frequently, knowing that any movement might attract unnecessary attention. Their role depended on blending into the background, reinforcing the room's appearance of abundance. Attempts to remain composed did not conceal the difficulty of the position. Standing for hours caused stiffness that spread through the lower back and legs. Smiling without a genuine purpose strained the muscles around the mouth. The weight of the gown, though modest, compared to the elaborate attire of wealthier women, still pressed on their shoulders and restricted their breath. Yet these discomforts stayed unspoken. To acknowledge them risked revealing vulnerability in a setting where invisibility was required. The social structure reinforced this invisibility through interaction. Men rarely approached the women standing near the walls. Invitations to dance followed predictable patterns, passing through the room's established hierarchy without reaching those placed at the edges. The women who served as background observed the scene with steady clarity, aware that none of the dancers would pause before them or extend a hand. They understood that their evening held no possibility of movement beyond where they stood. Other women in the ballroom recognized their position as well. Some greeted them with polite but distant smiles, gestures that acknowledged presence without inviting interaction. Others avoided looking in their direction altogether, as though the still figures along the wall reminded them of what failure or misfortune might look like in a room ruled by appearances. The separation between the two groups remained evident through posture, proximity, and the unspoken hierarchy that shaped the night. Despite their stillness, these women observed the ballroom with a perspective that differed from those in motion. They saw pairs forming and dissolving, alliances shifting, and conversations carried out in corners. They recognized subtle changes in expression, sudden hesitations before dances, and the strain hidden behind controlled gestures. Their vantage point offered clarity, though they held no influence over what unfolded. Their presence allowed the room to feel whole, yet their insight remained unacknowledged. The requirement to smile throughout the evening added another layer of endurance. The expression needed to remain soft, neither inviting nor dismissive. A smile too bright appeared eager. A neutral expression appeared cold. Maintaining the correct balance for hours stretched the limits of patience. Some women practiced the gesture at home, shaping their faces into the controlled warmth expected of them. In the ballroom, the smile became a silent companion present, even when fatigue settled into their bodies. At times, the isolation deepened. As music swelled and conversations intensified, the women along the walls felt the distance growing between themselves and everyone else in the room. They witnessed joy, ambition, and disappointment in others, without participating in any of it. The night continued around them, rising and falling with the rhythm of the dances, while they remained anchored to the edge of the space, fulfilling a role without recognition. When the event approached its end, their position remained unchanged. While others left the ballroom with new impressions, potential prospects, or strengthened alliances, these women departed, carrying only the memory of hours spent standing beneath the chandeliers. Their absence after each event went unnoticed, just as their presence during it passed without acknowledgement. Yet their role remained essential for maintaining the illusion of grandeur required by the evening. The ballroom returned to silence as candles dimmed, but the faint outlines of their presence lingered in the shadows, near the walls, places filled not by choice but by expectation. Some women filled the ballroom without ever entering its circle of opportunity. Their presence supported the elegance, others performed without sensing the strain carried in stillness. Behind that quiet endurance gathered a truth about the room's beauty, resting on those left unseen. Dancing in the ballroom appeared graceful to those who watched from a distance. The smooth turns, measured steps, and calm expressions created an image of harmony that guests admired. Yet for many of the women and men inside the rotating lines, the dance did not represent pleasure. It required discipline shaped by years of instruction pressure, rooted in family expectation and fear of making a mistake under constant observation. Each movement carried consequences beyond the floor, transforming the waltz and quadrille into tasks rather than forms of enjoyment. Training for these dances began in childhood. Families with ambition ensured that their daughters practiced posture, balance, and timing long before they reached adolescence. Their bodies learned the shapes demanded by the ballroom, arching the back, lifting the chin, controlling the shoulders. Young boys received similar guidance, expected to lead with precision and confidence. Lessons continued weekly, sometimes daily, until the steps became automatic. These routines imposed a structure that lasted into adulthood, shaping how dancers moved even outside the ballroom. Despite the repetition, each dancer knew that perfection remained fragile. The floor offered no forgiveness for hesitation or missteps. A single mistake visible to anyone watching carried social implications. Someone who stumbled or stepped off rhythm risked being judged as careless or unrefined. Invitations to future events depended on maintaining flawless performance, and families guarded these opportunities closely. Dancers, therefore, entered each set with heightened awareness, adjusting their breath and posture to ensure control over every motion. The fear of missteps heightened the tension. A foot placed too early or too late disrupted the entire pattern, drawing attention not only to the individual but to their partner. Women dreaded the possibility of being blamed for errors made by others, while men worried that a poor performance might suggest weak leadership. These concerns pressed into the dancers' bodies, tightening muscles and limiting natural movement. Enjoyment faded beneath the weight of responsibility. Guests positioned along the edges of the room contributed to this pressure. They observed the sequences with careful attention, noticing which couples glided smoothly and which ones faltered. Their silent assessments influenced how the evening unfolded. A dancer who performed flawlessly earned admiration and potential invitations. Someone who struggled became an object of quiet disappointment. These judgments remained unspoken, yet shaped the ballroom's social landscape. Some dancers carried genuine indifference toward music, participating only because tradition demanded it. They learned the steps mechanically, focusing on execution rather than connection to rhythm. Yet the ballroom required them to project enjoyment. Smiles needed to appear effortless. Expressions needed to show composure, and movements needed to reflect enthusiasm. The contrast between internal detachment and external performance created strain that deepened as the night progressed. The choreography itself demanded precision. Dancers moved through repeating patterns, forward steps, turns, and controlled glides that required alignment with both partner and music. Maintaining this coordination demanded constant attention. A woman balanced her weight carefully to avoid leaning too heavily on her partner. A man adjusted his grip to appear strong but not forceful. They responded subtly to shifts in tempo, ensuring that their steps matched the music exactly. The discipline required left little space for relaxation. Physical discomfort added further complexity. Corsets restricted breath and forced posture into unnatural shapes. Shoes offered minimal support, pressing into the feet with each step. The polished floor, though beautiful, increased the effort needed to maintain stability. Sweat gathered beneath gloves, disrupting grip, while the heat rising from the crowded room intensified fatigue. Despite these challenges, dancers continued, knowing that stopping prematurely could attract unwanted attention. The repetition of dances created additional fatigue. Quadrilles demanded coordination with multiple couples, requiring awareness of spatial patterns that shifted rapidly. Waltzes repeated their rotations, leaving dancers dizzy, yet expected to maintain clarity. Other forms required sudden changes in direction or tempo. The body absorbed these demands until muscles stiffened, but the dancer's expression needed to remain neutral. Only a few participants genuinely enjoyed the dances, yet their enthusiasm did not diminish the overall pressure. They too adhered to the unspoken rules, ensuring that their enjoyment did not disrupt the structure of the evening. Laughter held too long, or expressions too bright, risked appearing inappropriate. The ballroom valued harmony above sincerity, and dancers adapted accordingly. The night progressed through a series of sets, each one demanding the same precision as the last. As the evening stretched on, fatigue deepened, shoulders tightened, breath shortened, and steps became more difficult to control. Yet dancers forced themselves to continue, because leaving the floor early suggested weakness. The ballroom rewarded endurance as much as ability, and the expectation to persist overshadowed personal comfort. When the final notes drifted across the room, dancers allowed their posture to loosen slightly, though not enough to break decorum. They left the floor with controlled steps, hiding the tension that had built in their bodies. Observers saw only the elegance of the final bow or curtsy, unaware of the fatigue concealed beneath the gestures. Once outside the ballroom's glow, the strain became more visible. Shallow breaths, trembling hands, and sore muscles responding to the sudden stillness. Dancing remained central to the ballroom's identity, yet it rarely fulfilled the joy implied by its beauty. It served instead as another measure of discipline, compliance, and social alignment. Those who moved across the floor did so because expectation made it necessary, not because music drew them toward pleasure. The dance shaped the night, yet its demands overshadowed any sense of ease. The beauty admired by others depended on precision maintained through strain. Once the floor returned to stillness, the truth was that many danced not for joy but to preserve their place inside the room. Hunger enters a ballroom quietly. It does not disturb the chandeliers or the polished floor, nor does it alter the music that keeps spinning across the room. It rests under the fabric that women have pulled tight against their ribs, staying silent because the evening demands obedience. Hours before the first carriage stops at the entrance, the women who plan to step into the bright hall already carry a kind of restraint that begins long before the dancing starts. Their corsets wait beside their vanities like small cages, and each one knows that eating too much will make the tightening unbearable, so they choose to leave food behind. A few bites at most, maybe a sip of something light enough to avoid faintness, but never enough to satisfy the body that must endure the night. By late afternoon, the hunger is steady, predictable, almost routine. The women sit while their hair is pinned and sprayed their skin, powdered their gowns lifted and arranged. Someone stands behind the tugging the corset strings, and the breath they did not take turns into a pressure at the base of the throat. The day narrows into a single goal, to appear graceful when the ballroom doors open. Nothing must compromise that image. Not discomfort, not thirst, not the distant ache in the stomach that has been quiet since morning. When the lamps are lit and the orchestra tunes their instruments, the atmosphere thickens with perfume and anticipation. A crowd begins to gather, filling the room with layers of heat that hover above the polished floor. Each woman steps into the scene with careful posture, ribs held firm by the boning beneath her gown. Hunger shifts again, settling into the hollow between breath and silence. Thirst joins it soon after. Conversations create warmth, dancing intensifies it, and the air grows heavier with every passing minute. Servants move along the room's edges, their steps nearly soundless. They carry trays meant for the wealthy guests, glasses of punch, small sweets and candied fruit. Yet the women who pass by these trays know that biting into anything substantial risks the delicate shape created earlier in the evening. A gown stretched tight across the waist leaves no space for indulgence. A few might attempt a tiny piece of fruit, something soft and easy to swallow, but the corset quickly reminds them how little room remains. The discomfort is immediate. Many choose to decline entirely, bowing their heads slightly as the servant continues. The hours begin to stretch. A dance finishes, another begins. The ballroom's warmth presses against the skin, and beneath the silk, the body demands what it cannot openly ask for. Thirst grows sharper than hunger. It is not polite to leave the floor too often, and it is not graceful to betray fatigue, so the women endure. Their lips dry slightly, their breath slows, and the faint trembling in their hands is hidden behind gloves. Even the glimmer of sweat at the temples is dabbed away discreetly, leaving behind the same serene expression expected of them since they arrived. Some servants, those who understand how the evening truly works, find ways to offer relief without disrupting the ritual. They slip behind a column or along a shadowed corner carrying a small cloth-wrapped cup or a sliver of ice. A woman might approach under the guise of adjusting her glove, and the servant lifts the cup just enough for her to take a discreet sip. Others hide a bit of water inside the folds of a lace fan or slip a drop onto a handkerchief, passing it to the woman who needs it most. It is never much, never enough to fully refresh, but enough to keep the body standing beneath the gown that refuses to loosen. Time continues in long, steady loops of music and heat. Hunger sharpens, then dulls, as if it understands the rules of the evening. Thirst remains persistent, pressing against the edges of the corset, making the heartbeat feel louder beneath the silk. The women keep smiling, keep turning in circles, keep lifting their skirts just enough to avoid stepping on the hem. Each movement reminds them of the tightness around the waist, the pressure across the ribs, the narrow breath that must be controlled. Nothing about the night allows comfort, yet nothing allows retreat either. When the orchestra pauses between sets, the ballroom does not soften. People continue talking, laughing, assessing one another from across the room. A woman might step aside for a moment, pretending to adjust the fall of her skirt, when in truth she is granting her body a brief pause from the strain. Hunger is still there, a quiet weight in the abdomen, and thirst sits like a thin thread across the tongue. Both remain hidden beneath the silk that conceals far more than fabric alone. The evening's elegance depends on silence. Silence about discomfort, silence about want, silence about the physical cost of appearing flawless. Each woman knows that acknowledgement of need would only make her look weak, unprepared, or out of place. So she keeps every sensation beneath the surface. The crowd sees the shimmer of the gown, the calm of the posture, the effortless turning of each step. No one sees the small desperation that gathers beneath the lace. By the time the final dances approach, the hunger has settled into fatigue. The women continue their movements slower but still precise, their expressions unchanged. They have mastered the art of quiet endurance. When the last chord fades, many feel a faint dizziness, a reminder that their bodies have been asked to tolerate more than anyone in the room will ever mention. The night allowed no space for the needs hidden under silk. The pressure to maintain poise outweighed the quiet signals of the body. Where the music began to thin, lingered the truth that refinement often demanded a silent surrender. Rumors breathe most easily once the ballroom doors close. The chandeliers fall silent, the music fades into the floor, and the gowns, still heavy with perfume and heat, are carried back through dim corridors. While carriages roll away from the entrance, another kind of gathering begins across the city. It does not require orchestras or polished floors. It needs only ears, memory, and the quiet hunger for stories that seem too perfect to resist. A ballroom night may last a few hours, but the aftermath stretches far beyond dawn. The smallest gestures witnessed in passing become sparks for a chain of whispers that no one can fully control. Servants leave first, stepping back into the cold, with information folded inside their thoughts. They have seen more than the guests who stood under the lights. They know who paused behind the curtains longer than expected, who argued silently through stiff posture, who walked too quickly toward a secluded hall. They carry these observations through alleyways, kitchens, stables, and servants' quarters. Each detail slips into familiar ears, passed in low tones, careful but steady. By morning, many of these fragments begin traveling farther than the servants ever intended. The wealthy families return home, unaware of how quickly their night will be retold. Within hours, lamps flicker in drawing rooms across the city, as relatives gather to reconstruct what they believe happened. Someone recalls a glance exchanged too boldly. Someone else remembers a dress color that seemed chosen with intent. None of these recollections is precise. They drift and blend, reshaped by personal expectations, quiet resentment, or the satisfaction of revealing something before anyone else. The glow of the ballroom dims, and what remains is a structure built from speculation rather than memory. Newspapers devoted to social life prepare their columns with unusual speed. These sheets circulate widely, wrapped in anticipation, delivered to breakfast tables, where families lean forward to inspect every line. The writers rarely attend the events themselves, yet they know how to create stories that appear true enough to believe. A woman who danced twice with the same man becomes a subject of whispered analysis. A gentleman who left early is described as troubled, distracted, or hiding something he does not wish the city to know. Each sentence is shaped to entertain more than inform, but the readers seldom notice the distinction. Rumors expand as they pass from one house to another. 2 dances become 4. A brief smile becomes an unspoken promise. A stumble on the dance floor becomes evidence of deeper tension between families already rumored to be feuding. The truth becomes thin, stretched beneath layers of assumption. People repeat what they heard rather than what they saw, and each repetition adds a slight shift in tone. The city becomes a network of small vibrations, each window, each parlor, each shop contributing to the movement of the story. Some women wake with a sense of unease, already aware that their behavior from the night before may be circulating. A dance accepted too quickly or declined too slowly becomes material for strangers' conversations. They imagine the lines printed on the morning paper or whispered at midday gatherings. Their place in society depends not only on how they carry themselves inside a ballroom, but also on how those moments are interpreted once the evening ends. A gesture, intended as polite, may be misunderstood. A glance meant for no one may be assigned meaning by everyone. Men are not entirely spared from this scrutiny. Their choices are examined in similar ways, though the consequences rarely cut as deeply. A man seen lingering near someone else's wife becomes a character in a narrative built entirely outside his awareness. His actions are assigned motives. His silence is considered a strategy. The truth does not matter as much as the impression formed overnight. By midday, the rumors develop momentum. Markets whisper. Carriages exchange observations at crossings. Seamstresses and tailors hear discussions that influence future dress orders. Florists overhear plans for new gatherings shaped by last night's stories. The city does not simply pass along information. It absorbs it and adjusts its rhythm accordingly. A household may delay sending an invitation for fear of appearing too eager. Another may hasten to schedule a gathering to redirect attention toward a different subject. Social gravity shifts based on nothing more than interpretation, filtered through countless perspectives. Some rumors fade within hours. Others cling to the edges of conversation for weeks. A family with a fragile reputation might find it fractured entirely because of a story that grew too quickly to contain. A woman whose dance card appeared slightly unusual might spend an entire season trying to repair the image she did not realize she had damaged. These outcomes do not require malice. They arise from the city's constant appetite for narratives that appear elegant, dramatic, or tragic when spoken aloud. No one can fully predict which details will catch hold. Sometimes it is a mistake, a misstep, a moment of visible fatigue. Other times, it is no more than the color of a dress or the tilt of a head. But once spoken, the rumor travels through the city with a life of its own, untouched by the intentions of those it describes. A ballroom is temporary. The retelling of it is not. The night dissolved, but its fragments continued drifting across the city. The echoes of glances and gestures grew larger than the moments that created them. Beyond the fading music remained the quiet truth that nothing witnessed inside a ballroom truly stayed confined to its walls. People stepped into the ballroom, expecting music order and a familiar pattern of movement, but inside that polished world danger waited quietly in places no one liked to mention. The room was bright and crowded, and everyone behaved as though grace and control ruled the night. Yet beneath the layers of silk, velvet, and polished manners, there were moments when the illusion cracked. A dance that seemed harmless from afar could turn into something far heavier, when bodies pressed together, when air thinned, or when tempers slipped just slightly out of line. The ballroom gave the impression of safety, but it carried risks that people learned to ignore until they were forced to face them directly. Many young women arrived already exhausted, their corsets tightened far beyond comfort because appearance mattered more than breath. They walked onto the floor with stiff backs and faint smiles, trying to hide how little air reached their lungs. During a waltz, when the turning became too fast, a few of them suddenly swayed, their feet stumbling in ways that did not match the music. On some nights, a girl collapsed without warning. Her face would drain of color, her hands would loosen around her partner's sleeve, and she would slide to the floor as though every part of her body had stopped at once. The room often froze in silence before movement returned, but not every collapse ended with recovery. Stories traveled quietly among servants about a young woman who never rose again after her breath was cut off too long by the corset she wore. Her family insisted it was an unexpected illness. The guests pretended it was a tragedy without cause. The truth stayed buried under the need to protect reputations. The ballroom also carried a more physical kind of danger, the one that appeared when too many people fought for the same bit of space or attention. During popular dances, chairs were scarce, and groups sometimes tried to claim them quickly between sets. One sharp push, one pair of hands grabbing too hard, could send someone falling backward onto the polished floor. In one well-known incident, whispered among maids, a dispute over a chair ended with a young woman striking her head so hard that she never regained consciousness. The family avoided any public mention of it, and the ballroom resumed its routine the following week without acknowledging what had happened. People preferred not to linger on how quickly an ordinary gesture could shift into something irreversible. There were also dangers that came from emotion rather than accident. Jealousy, frustration, and wounded pride traveled easily between the couples circling the room. A dance was expected to be polite and controlled, but when alcohol flowed and boundaries blurred, small slights became fuel for sharper conflicts. After one winter ball, a gentleman confronted another man outside the venue, furious that the rival had spent too many dances with the woman he admired. The argument turned into a fight, and the blade that appeared was quick and unplanned. By the time the shouting stopped, one man lay bleeding on the cobblestones. People exiting the building stepped carefully around the scene, pretending they had not seen anything. The newspapers wrote about a personal matter. The ballroom continued as usual. Despite these events, society kept returning to the same halls, the same music, the same notion that elegance could protect them from the reality hiding inside each evening. The dangers were known yet unspoken. Guests whispered a little, then carried on. Servants remembered everything, though they rarely had the right to speak openly about it. The chandeliers remained bright, and the orchestra played on as though polished floors and structured rules could erase what had happened the night before. The risk of harm did not come from chaos or drunken crowds, but from the expectation that everyone must pretend nothing could go wrong. People ignored the signs, the tightened breath, the aggressive shove, the trembling hands of those overwhelmed by the atmosphere. They insisted that discipline kept everything under control, but the pressure made the room fragile. One wrong movement, one misread intention, or one emotional slip was enough to turn a controlled setting into a scene no one wished to remember. Ballroom culture demanded that people hide their discomfort, their fear, and their exhaustion. By forcing everyone to maintain the illusion, it also forced them to face danger alone. When viewed closely, the idea that a dance could end a life was not dramatic imagination. It was part of the environment created by social rules, physical constraints, and the unspoken belief that appearances were worth any cost. People stepped into the ballroom thinking they knew what the night would bring, but the truth was that every gathering carried invisible tension under its polished surface. Guests believed they were safe, though they were surrounded by conditions that tested every breath, every step, and every impulse. The movements of the ballroom always hid more weight than the music suggested. The night left its marks on those who tried too hard to meet its demands. Beneath the shine of the chandeliers lingered the question of what the next danger might look like. Men entered the ballroom, carrying expectations that looked simple from the outside, but felt far heavier once the doors closed behind them. The atmosphere suggested confidence and ease, as though every gentleman naturally understood how to behave, when to step forward, and how to offer his arm with the exact balance of courtesy and restraint. The truth was quieter and sharper. Each man stood under an invisible pressure that dictated his movements and judged him for every small misstep. The room demanded skill, money, and a level of control that many struggled to maintain. The first task was learning how to ask a woman to dance. It sounded easy when described at family tables or in polite conversation, yet the actual moment was watched by dozens of eyes. A gentleman could not appear too eager, because eagerness was read as desperation, the kind associated with men lacking status or refinement. At the same time, he could not appear hesitant, because hesitation suggested insecurity or embarrassment qualities that made him less desirable. He needed to walk toward a young woman with a steady pace, offer a respectful bow, and speak with a tone that neither rushed nor wavered. That narrow space between eagerness and indifference carried its own kind of danger. Men practiced it in mirrors, hallways, and empty rooms, though no one admitted it publicly. Money carved another line through the evening. A man's clothing had to appear effortless, yet nothing about it was cheap. Gloves needed to be spotless, even if he replaced them frequently. Jackets and waistcoats required tailoring that cost more than many families earned in a month. Some men spent days polishing their shoes to hide scuffs, because scuffs hinted at limited means. Many also used expensive perfumes not because they enjoyed them, but because they masked sweat and nervousness more reliably than anything else. Every piece of clothing, every small accessory served as silent evidence that he belonged among the guests. Without them, he risked looking like an intruder. The expectation extended to physical appearance as well. Men were judged by posture, the steadiness of their gaze, and the precision of their dance steps. A stumble meant more than losing rhythm. It meant displaying a flaw in public, a weakness that could be discussed by families and matchmakers long after the music faded. A man who moved without confidence risked being labelled unworthy of marriage. Rumours spread quickly among mothers and aunts who watched the floor with sharp eyes. The label of incompetence once assigned was difficult to remove. A single mistake could define him for an entire season. The dance itself required strict attention. A gentleman had to guide his partner without gripping too tightly or standing too far away. Each turn needed to be executed with control. If his footwork drifted slightly off the expected pattern, he risked colliding with another couple or pulling his partner into an awkward pause. These moments were rarely forgiven. People noticed everything, even gestures that lasted only a second. Some men felt their hearts race as they waited for the music to begin, knowing that a full room of strangers would be silently evaluating each movement. Men also bore responsibility for keeping conversations calm and pleasant. They had to avoid topics that could stir disagreement. They had to speak enough to show interest, but not so much that they seemed intrusive. Silence could be misinterpreted as dullness. Talkativeness could be read as arrogance. Every sentence had weight, and men measured their words carefully, even when fatigue pulled at their concentration. The evening allowed no excuses. A gentleman who failed to maintain composure risked losing invitations, opportunities, and social standing. Not all men enjoyed these expectations, yet very few challenged them. Many came to the ballroom, already tired from work or travel, but forced themselves to appear unbothered. Others carried financial burdens they tried to conceal behind polished buttons and crisp fabrics. Some practiced dance patterns alone in their rooms late at night, hoping to avoid humiliation. The ballroom demanded that men appear confident and successful, even when their lives outside the hall were full of strain. They arrived with their own worries, but had to bury them under the performance required by society. The unspoken truth was that men were also afraid of being judged. Women faced immense pressure related to appearance, posture, and marriage prospects, but men faced their own kind of scrutiny. Every gesture was compared with the standards set by wealthier families. Every movement was watched by potential in-laws. A man who failed in this environment did not only risk embarrassment, he risked disappointing his family, losing connections, and appearing unfit for the roles expected of him. The ballroom looked like a place for celebration, yet it held the power to reshape a man's future in ways he could not control. Some men coped by pretending they felt nothing. Others drank more than they should. A few disappeared from conversations and stood near the walls, trying to steady their breath. None of these reactions was openly acknowledged. Everyone maintained the illusion that men carried their responsibilities lightly. The truth was that many left the ballroom with stiff shoulders, aching feet, and a sense of relief that the night was finally over. Every gesture expected of men carried a cost that rarely appeared on their faces. The ballroom demanded precision that left little room for human error. Under the polished surface remained the question of how many men endured more than they were willing to admit. The ballroom presented itself as a disciplined environment filled with rules and expectations that were meant to maintain order. People believed that beauty, music, and etiquette kept darker impulses at a distance. Yet beneath the bright lights and polished movements, there existed a quiet exchange of glances that carried far more meaning than the dance steps themselves. The room allowed strangers to step closer than daily life permitted, and that closeness created opportunities that many pretended not to see. What began as polite formality often drifted into something else when the music stretched on for too long. Couples who were officially married rarely stayed together throughout the evening. Husbands moved through the crowd, greeting acquaintances, sharing brief remarks about business or travel. Wives followed the social rhythm expected of them, accepting invitations to dance with men who stood higher, equal, or lower in status. That separation created long stretches, during which spouses barely crossed paths. Observers rarely questioned this arrangement because it had existed for generations. The structure of the ballroom, with its rotating partners and its emphasis on social variety, made emotional distance feel normal even when it was not. Some affairs began so quietly that no one could identify the first moment of connection. A single dance held just a bit longer than necessary. A man steps closer under the excuse of guiding a turn. A woman lowering her gaze just long enough to acknowledge a feeling she was not meant to reveal. These gestures appeared insignificant to those watching, yet the people involved often felt a slight shift they could not fully ignore. The ballroom allowed these shifts because it was filled with crowded corners, slow-moving lines of guests, and moments when two people could speak without witnesses leaning too close. Some men attended balls specifically to meet women who felt unseen by their husbands. Some women welcomed the attention because the ballroom was one of the few spaces where they were treated as individuals rather than symbols of social duty. This exchange was rarely stated openly. It grew through repetition. One dance accepted another, expected a conversation that carried on longer than necessary. Each encounter built a foundation that seemed harmless until it was not. People often noticed the pattern only when the pair began seeking each other too quickly across the room. Long dances, especially waltzes, created additional opportunities. A couple could spend several minutes moving through a pattern that required close contact and steady breathing. That duration blurred the line between formality and something more personal. Their hands remained joined, their bodies moved in coordinated rhythm, and the rest of the room faded into a blur. These moments allowed feelings to develop faster than the participants anticipated. Guests watching could not always detect the shift, but servants who moved through the ballroom recognized the signs easily. They saw the same faces turning toward each other repeatedly, the same two stepping aside for a private conversation between sets. When the music ended, people often assumed the connection ended with it, but that was rarely the case. Some couples slipped away to quieter rooms used for storing coats or refreshments. Others arranged future meetings during the pauses between dances, signaling through small gestures the agreed-upon time and place. Once the evening concluded, they walked through separate doors, giving the appearance of propriety. Yet they remained bound by a promise made silently while the orchestra played. There were also the private gatherings that occurred later at night. These smaller events involved fewer guests and were not advertised openly. They took place in homes where doors could be locked and curtains drawn. The attendees were selected carefully, often through the invitation of someone who understood which couples sought discretion. At these gatherings, the rules of the main ballroom no longer applied. People spoke more freely, touched more openly, and allowed themselves the kind of behavior that would ruin them if witnessed publicly. Many affairs deepened in these rooms, protected by the agreement that everyone present shared the same need for secrecy. Marriages strained under these circumstances, though most couples never addressed the tension directly. Public confrontation threatened reputations, and silence preserved appearances. Wives who suspected infidelity pretended not to notice. Husbands who felt their spouses drift toward other men dismissed it as a temporary curiosity. The ballroom continued to provide a convenient explanation for behavior that in any other setting would have been questioned immediately. By hiding under the structure of polite society, these relationships managed to survive far longer than they should have. Not every affair ended dramatically. Some faded quietly once the season concluded. Others collapsed under guilt or fear of discovery. But a few endured, shaping lives in ways that could not be undone. The ballroom became the place where choices began that changed families, reputations, and futures. Everyone pretended the risks were small, yet the evidence circulated through whispers, sudden absences, and strained greetings exchanged the following year. The culture of the ballroom encouraged these outcomes because it offered both opportunity and plausible denial. People trusted the setting too much, believing that etiquette protected them from their own desires. Instead, the very structure of the event created the conditions that allowed forbidden relationships to grow unnoticed. A single dance accepted without thought could shift the direction of two lives in ways they realized only when the consequences appeared. The ballroom created moments that reached farther than anyone intended. The night left behind connections that did not disappear once the music stopped. Behind its polished order waited the question of what people were willing to risk for a feeling they barely understood. Children entered the ballroom long before they understood what was expected of them. Their faces still carried the softness of youth, yet the clothing placed on their bodies belonged to people twice their age. Girls barely past 14 stood with stiff posture, trying to imitate the calm expressions of adult women, even though their eyes revealed uncertainty. Boys of similar age greeted guests with the formality required of noble sons, though their hands sometimes trembled when they lifted a glass or adjusted a cuff. The ballroom treated them as participants rather than observers, giving them responsibilities they had no chance to refuse. Families brought their daughters to these gatherings with clear intentions. A girl's presence signaled that she was ready to be considered by the families of potential husbands. No one asked whether she felt prepared. Her age did not matter as much as her usefulness to alliances and inheritance lines. The moment she stepped inside the ballroom, she moved into a role that erased her childhood. Adults watched her closely, evaluating her posture, her gestures, her politeness. Every movement was recorded silently by those who hoped to find either an advantage or a flaw. She learned quickly that hesitation was interpreted as weakness, and that smiling too widely was considered inappropriate. The dance floor became her test, and she had to perform without showing fear. The boys followed a different, but equally demanding path. Before they reached adulthood, they were taught how to bow, how to guide a partner, and how to speak with the polished restraint expected of their rank. Many of them would rather have run through fields or explored forests, but their families insisted that ballroom manners were essential to their futures. They practiced steps until their feet ached, not because they enjoyed the music, but because competence in dancing proved their readiness to manage estates and negotiate relationships. When they invited a girl to dance, the invitation carried meaning far beyond their understanding. If they misjudged a moment or offended someone unknowingly, the consequences fell not only on them, but on the families they represented. These young participants walked into a world where adults spoke in coded language and expectations were rarely stated openly. They sensed tension between families without knowing the history behind it. They watched mothers judge one another through small gestures. They saw fathers exchange polite words that masked years of rivalry. The children learned quickly that silence kept them safe. They listened more than they spoke, absorbing rules without being allowed to question them. The ballroom did not permit curiosity. It required obedience. Girls were often uncomfortable in their clothing, yet complaining was not allowed. Corsets tightened around ribs that had not finished growing. Heavy skirts restricted their steps, hairpins pulled at their scalps until their eyes watered. Still, they were expected to stand with steady composure, pretending that the discomfort was nothing unusual. Boys wore jackets too stiff for their shoulders, boots that pinched their heels, and collars that limited their movement. They did not admit the strain because doing so would embarrass their families. Both boys and girls learned early that the ballroom rewarded endurance, not honesty. The conversations held around them were not meant for them, yet they were always pulled into the center of adult concerns. A girl's dance card filled too quickly or too slowly could alarm a mother. A boy's awkward bow could spark comments among relatives. Every error was magnified because people believed that children reflected their family's discipline. The young ones felt this pressure without being able to escape it. When the music started, they stepped into positions they had practiced repeatedly, hoping their bodies would remember the patterns, even when their minds were overwhelmed by the noise and movement around them. Some children adapted quickly, copying the gestures of older dancers until they blended into the room. Others struggled, their anxiety visible in their uneven breathing or stiff arms. These signs were noticed instantly. Nothing in the ballroom remained private. Servants whispered about which young guests seemed distressed. Mothers tightened their grip on daughters' hands during pauses between dances. Fathers reminded sons to stand straighter, to maintain eye contact to hide fatigue. Every correction reinforced the same lesson. Childhood had no place here. The absence of a true childhood created consequences that lingered long past the evening. Many girls learned to measure their value solely through the attention they received during these events. Many boys learned to suppress their emotions because vulnerability was treated as a flaw. They grew into adults, shaped by expectations placed on them before they understood what choice meant. The ballroom became their introduction to a society that valued control more than comfort and reputation, more than personal desire. What made this environment more unsettling was how normal it appeared to everyone involved. Families did not consider the burden they placed on their children. Guests admired young girls who stood quietly without complaint. They praised boys who performed their roles without faltering. People believed they were preparing their children for adulthood, not realizing that they were demanding adulthood far too early. The room's bright lights hid the strain, making the scene appear orderly even when the children inside it felt overwhelmed. In time, some of these young participants grew into adults who repeated the same expectations with their own children. The cycle continued because the ballroom remained a central tool of social life. The weight carried by children became part of the structure itself, rarely questioned and rarely challenged. To the outside observer, the ballroom looked elegant. To the children inside it, the experience often felt like the end of something they never had time to enjoy. The ballroom pushed children into roles they were not ready to carry. Their youth faded under the pressure of expectations that allowed little space to breathe. Beyond the bright surface remained the quiet truth that childhood slipped away long before anyone admitted it. When the last note of music faded and the guests began to step away from the ballroom floor, the atmosphere changed in small but noticeable ways. The chandeliers still cast their light across the polished surfaces, but the brightness no longer carried the same energy. People no longer smiled as widely conversations softened, and bodies that had moved with practiced grace now revealed the stiffness caused by hours of standing, turning, and performing for others. The transition from celebration to departure created a moment of quiet strain that most guests pretended not to notice. The ballroom kept its elegance until the final guest left, but once they stepped outside, the consequences of the evening became impossible to ignore. Many young women returned to their rooms with legs that felt heavy and numb. Hours spent in tightly laced corsets and shoes made for appearance rather than comfort left marks on their bodies that they would carry through the night. Servants helped them remove the layers of fabric, but there was no conversation about the pain or fatigue. The day's duties required silence, not sympathy. Some girls sat on the edge of their beds for several minutes before attempting to stand again, waiting for sensation to return to their feet. Their hands shook slightly as they unpinned their hair. No one asked how they felt, and they did not expect anyone to do so. These young women also carried a weight that did not leave visible marks. The pressure to secure a marriage grew heavier with each event. Families observed the number of invitations each girl received, the men who approached her, and the ones who did not. Every evening became a measurement of her worth in the eyes of society. Some girls began to feel a constant tightness in their chest, even when they were not dancing. The expectation to appear cheerful, graceful, and eager created a quiet tension that echoed through their daily lives. Many experienced sleeplessness or long periods of sadness, though no one used such words openly. People simply described them as sensitive or overwhelmed. Those who were not invited to the ballroom carried a different kind of burden. For them, the night served as a reminder of the distance between their world and the world they wished to enter. These individuals watched the carriages pass by without slowing for their houses. They heard music drift through open windows but never stepped inside. A lack of invitation said more than a spoken rejection. It meant that their presence was unnecessary, their families unimportant, their names irrelevant to ongoing alliances. Some tried to dismiss the exclusion as expected, but the reality stung each time a ball was held. Without access to the ballroom, their chances at social advancement were limited before their lives had even begun. Guests who did attend the ball often faced a different form of isolation once they returned home. Households grew quite quickly, and the noise of the ballroom seemed distant, despite ending only minutes earlier. Many guests realized how alone they felt, only when faced with the silence. The evening had demanded energy, confidence, and constant alertness. Now that the performance ended, the exhaustion settled deeper. Some stared at their reflections, noticing the fatigue in their eyes. Others removed their jewelry slowly, as though delaying the return to ordinary life. The glamour of the ballroom did not travel with them. It stayed behind, leaving them to navigate the contrast between public display and private emptiness. Men experienced their own version of this shift. They removed their gloves and jackets, feeling the stiffness in their shoulders, where tension had accumulated throughout the night. Their collars left red marks on their skin. They sat alone in their dressing rooms, replaying conversations that did not go as intended and dance steps that had faltered slightly. The pressure to appear confident, wealthy, and capable weighed more heavily when they were alone. Some wondered whether they had made a positive impression. Others believed they had failed. The ballroom measured them just as sharply as it measured women, though society rarely acknowledged it. Servants moved through these homes during the late hours, observing fragments of exhaustion that families tried to conceal. They saw young women wiping makeup smudges from their faces, leaving faint lines that reflected the strain of the evening. They heard quiet sighs behind closed doors. They carried discarded shoes and heavy gowns that smelled of sweat and perfume. Though they witnessed the private toll of each event, they did not speak of it. Their role required stillness, not commentary. The emotional distance between the ballroom and the bedrooms where guests ended their night revealed a truth people rarely confronted. The celebration exhausted them more than it delighted them. The social expectations left small gaps in their lives where comfort should have been. Every guest carried a sense of isolation that deepened during these quiet hours, yet few admitted it even to themselves. They repeated the same pattern each season, believing the next event might bring something different, though nothing ever changed. The contrast between public admiration and private loneliness created a cycle that shaped the way people viewed themselves. Many associated their value solely with their performance under the ballroom lights. When the evening ended, they were left without the reassurance they had spent hours trying to earn. It took only a few minutes of silence for the pressure to settle again, this time without distraction. The world outside the ballroom felt dimmer, heavier, and less forgiving. People often claimed that the ballroom represented the height of social life, yet its effects extended well beyond its walls. Each event left guests more tired, more uncertain, and more aware of the expectations they had failed to meet. Each return home showed them how alone they felt once the music stopped. The illusion of unity created by shared dances dissolved, quickly replaced by a quiet understanding that every guest carried their burdens separately. The ballroom left many with a fatigue that lingered far longer than the celebration itself. Its glow faded quickly, revealing the distance between performance and comfort. Outside that fading light remained the quiet truth that loneliness grew strongest when the music finally disappeared. The ballroom always looked flawless to those who entered it for the first time. The chandeliers glowed steadily. The musicians arranged their instruments with practiced composure, and the polished floor reflected every movement with reassuring clarity. People believed that such an order reflected honesty, as though elegance and truth naturally belonged together. But anyone who stayed long enough watching the dances season after season began to understand that the room itself encouraged a kind of performance that extended beyond the choreography. Each smile, each bow, each polite exchange had been practiced repeatedly until sincerity and habit became impossible to separate. The women carried the heaviest part of this performance. They entered the ballroom with expressions that suggested calm delight, but underneath their gowns were layers of fabric and bone that pressed into their skin until it bruised. Corsets tightened around their rib cages, limiting how deeply they could breathe. The dresses looked beautiful, yet the beauty concealed the discomfort that shaped every step. Many learned to walk without showing how much the clothing restrained them. Their smiles were steady, even when their vision blurred for a moment, due to the pressure on their lungs. The guests around them accepted this display, without question believing that such control reflected refinement. Men played their part as well, though their discomfort appeared differently. Their jackets were stiff, their collars restrictive, and their shoes polished to the point where each step felt cautious. They spoke calmly, while monitoring every gesture, making sure none appeared careless or inappropriate. Their role demanded confidence, even when they felt uncertain. They were required to approach, invite, guide, and maintain conversation with the exact amount of restraint expected of their position. Any deviation risked embarrassment. They did not talk about the strain. Their silence maintained the illusion that male composure came naturally. Throughout the night, people moved around the room, as though guided by invisible lines drawn across the floor. Every gesture followed a rule, every pause had meaning, and every glance carried potential consequences. Yet beneath this structure, exhaustion and anxiety collected quietly. Guests who had spent hours preparing their appearance felt their bodies tighten under the weight of expectation. Those who feared judgment stood straighter than necessary, trying to hold themselves together as the hours passed. Nothing about the room permitted rest. Still, everyone acted as though the atmosphere inspired joy rather than pressure. Some women cried in private before entering the ballroom, wiping their faces until the redness faded. Some men hesitated outside the door, gathering enough confidence to pretend they felt at ease once inside. None of this appeared in the polished scenes observed by the crowd. The ballroom did not welcome visible discomfort. People learned to store their emotions quietly, saving them for the solitude that waited long past midnight. Even the most successful evenings held their own contradictions. A night filled with praise, dances, and small victories did not guarantee happiness. Some guests returned home believing they had done everything correctly, only to feel a heaviness settle in their chest once the doors closed behind them. They replayed conversations, wondering whether they spoke too softly or too boldly. They questioned their posture, their timing, and the way their hands shook when they lifted a glass. The ballroom rewarded appearance, not contentment. The room did not provide reassurance, it only demanded more. Those who struggled received no comfort. A young woman whose dance card remained half empty often walked home with lowered eyes, though she tried to maintain dignity. A young man who stumbled slightly during a dance felt the mistake follow him through the entire evening. People rarely offered kindness in those moments. They observed, judged, and moved on. The ballroom encouraged competition disguised as elegance. Silence became the safest reaction even when someone's failure was visible. The loneliness inside that environment was not loud. It settled slowly, filling the spaces between conversations and movements. A person could be surrounded by hundreds of guests, yet feel their isolation grow with each passing dance. The pressure to maintain composure created a barrier between individuals. Even close friends struggled to speak honestly inside such a structured setting. When the music played, they stepped into their expected roles. When the music stopped, they prepared for the next display. Authenticity rarely had space to breathe. Servants noticed details that others ignored. They saw the tremble in a hand holding a fan. They saw the red marks left by tight shoes. They saw the drained expressions of guests as they left the hall. They also saw the tears that appeared in brief hidden moments, quickly wiped away before anyone else could notice. The ballroom demanded that emotions remain contained. Servants understood more about the true atmosphere of the event than the guests themselves, yet they said nothing. Their presence was not meant to interrupt the performance. As the night ended, the ballroom slowly returned to silence. The final guests stepped outside carriages, rolled into the darkness, and the orchestra lowered their instruments. The chandeliers dimmed gradually. The polished floor carried faint marks of the evening's movements, light scuffs, footprints, and traces of powder that settled during the dances. These were the only visible reminders of the hours spent performing. Everything else was buried beneath the practiced elegance that defined each event. What made the ballroom so striking was not its beauty or its structure, but the ease with which it concealed discomfort. Guests believed they participated in something admirable, something representative of order and refinement. They did not realize how deeply the environment shaped their actions, thoughts, and self-worth. They walked through the hall, believing they controlled their experience, unaware that the expectations around them dictated more than they understood. The ballroom did not lie openly. It simply encouraged everyone to lie to themselves. When viewed this way, the ballroom resembled a theater more than a gathering place. People memorized their roles, rehearsed their expressions, and corrected their movements to match what others expected. The performance continued until the final light dimmed. Only in the privacy of their rooms did they remove the weight of their clothing, their expectations, and their carefully arranged smiles. That moment of solitude revealed the cost of the night: aching bodies, strained nerves, and a quiet sadness that often remained unnamed. In the end, the ballroom achieved its purpose. It kept society orderly, maintained alliances, and preserved a flawless public image. But the image came at a cost. People learned to hide their discomfort so effectively that they forgot how to express it. They accepted loneliness as a normal part of existence. They believed pressure was simply another requirement of refinement. And they returned to the ballroom again and again, repeating the performance because the alternative seemed even more uncertain. Good evening. Thank you for staying until the last light faded. Sleep well, and let the night be softer than the world you have just walked through.